special guest for opening remarks. We're really excited to have our Secretary for Environmental Protection here today. Please welcome Jared Blumenfeld.
Hi, Asha. Thank you. Thank you to Asha. We also have Meredith Williams, Dr. Meredith Williams, our new director of DTSC. Let's give her a rousing, yeah. And as you know, Meredith came from Safer Consumer Products. We're lucky enough to have Carl, who's doing that right now. So Carl, thank you so much for being here too. And thank you everyone in the room. My basic take is when you think about the public expects some degree of safety. So when you read in the newspaper that PFAS, which most people are never going to get, including me, to Asha's level of being able to articulate what they mean. They know that they're not good. They know that they last a very long time in the environment. They know that they have human health impacts. And when you then say that they're being found in things like food packaging, people are like, what? Where is government? Where is the business community? Where is academia? Why are these things still happening? So I think people like to point the finger. That's not our goal. Our goal is really to work collaboratively as a community, the regulated industry, us, really every stakeholder to come up with solutions. Because the last thing that people want is just, which I think we have too much in our society, is a lot of blame and not a lot of action. So our goal is to try and remove the barriers, and that's really what Safer Consumer Products is about. It's about thinking about alternatives. Are there different ways of achieving the same goal? And I certainly hope there are in food packaging. If you need to have PFAS in those kind of consumer products, people are already unsure about their water supply. It's a national issue where there's a lot of uncertainty and not enough clarity. And our goal in this exercise today and moving forward is to bring as much light and clarity to the process and then work collaboratively across barriers to understand how to solve those problems. So we at CalEPA, and certainly at DTSC and OEHA and all the boards and departments, actually PFAS is certainly not in food packaging, but generally is one of the things that nearly touches everything that we do. So we're here with our host DTSC, but we also are calling upon the full range of experts. And really expertise is important, right? You shouldn't have to have a PhD to go into a fast food restaurant and work out what's in the packaging. You should presume that there's safety, and that's obviously a complicated word, what that means, but you should at least presume they're not toxic bioaccumulative toxins in there that are going to affect you directly. So our goal with this workshop today, as with all the work that we do, is to think about the problem, understand it, hopefully reach some consensus around what it is that we can and should do to go forward, and then amongst those range of alternatives, pick one working collaboratively with the regulated industries in this room and outside to come up with solutions that make sense for everyone. So it sounds easy, but it isn't, right? We all know we've gone through these processes before. I think the program itself, Safer Consumer Products, has turned the corner in terms of really having knowledge under its belt. It's working with you all to prove how this can be done differently. This doesn't need to be adversarial. This can be a collaboration. So that's my goal for this workshop, to come up with solutions that don't take decades to implement, but paths forwards where we understand alternatives that can be implemented fairly quickly and reasonably. So if we can do it for this, we can continue the trend of doing it for other products. The governor in his budget, working with OEHA, but many people in this room, proposed $6 million for doing what we all have recognized needs to be done as the next step on chemicals policy, which is computational toxicology, and also obviously looking at biological ways of understanding across a whole set of chemicals, whether it's PFASs or other groups, understanding kind of what are the hazard traits so that you can read across and understand without this incredibly laborious chemical by chemical, individual by individual scenario. So that's an exciting, I think, transformative and hopefully collaborative. I'd love to think about how we can collaborate with people in this room. When I've met with other states, Massachusetts and North Carolina, they're all like, how can we bring in as much of our thinking, computing power to do a lot of this work together? So I think collaboration is the name of the game. There's a lot of pressure outside this room for us to fight and for us to be oppositional. That's not what we're here to do today. So if you came here like with your boxing gloves on, take them off and think about at the beginning of the year how we can work together to solve this complex problem and many more like it. Thank you, and thank you to Asha for hosting us.
Thanks so much for kicking us off, Secretary Blumenfeld. Now we're going to get started with our morning presentations. If we have time after each presentation, we will open it up to clarifying questions. Otherwise, we'd like to ask if you could hold your questions and comments until we start our panel discussions. We do have a couple of presentations where the speakers will be presenting remotely. For these, we will have a little extra time since they won't be able to join the panel. Now I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker. Andre Algazi is a section chief in the Safer Consumer Products Program and has led the chemical and product evaluation team since the program's creation in 2013. Previously, he worked in the DTSC's Office of Pollution Prevention, where he led implementation of laws regulating the use of hazardous chemicals in a variety of consumer products. Please welcome Mr. Algazi.
Is there a clicker? Thank you, Asha, and good morning, everybody. So before we get into the panel discussions today, we would like to kind of give you some context and orientation for what we're talking about today with regard to food, PFASs and food packaging. We had a public webinar back in October that many of you may have participated in, and if you did, then this won't be new to you, but for the benefit of people who may not remember, just to refresh your memory, or who weren't there, I'd like to just sort of start with an overview of our regulatory framework. This slide shows in the four horizontal bars the 4 steps of our regulatory process. It begins with chemicals. We have what's called a candidate chemicals list, which is a list of 23 lists of chemicals that have been identified based on either a hazard trait like carcinogenicity or persistence, bioaccumulative and toxic, or exposure potential. All those lists compiled together comprise thousands of chemicals, maybe 5,000 chemicals, depending on how you count groups like PFASs, which in and of itself is maybe 5,000. The second step is products, priority products, and we are in sort of the preliminary to middle stages of identifying priority products with regard to food packaging. So that's where we are today. This process involves researching, compiling information, publishing technical documents, having dialogues like this one, and adopting regulations that ultimately identify a specific product chemical combination as a priority product. Once we've completed that step, we go on to step 3, which is alternatives analysis. In that step, the manufacturers of the product that we've listed in regulations do an alternatives analysis, which entails identifying what are the functional requirements of the product, why is the chemical of concern being used, what function does it serve, what possible alternatives exist that might meet the functional requirements, and then a detailed comparison of the adverse impacts that might, the relevant factors for each the priority product and the alternative. Based on the alternatives analysis, which is a fairly detailed technical analysis, we then go to step 4, which is regulatory response. So the main kind of takeaway from this process is that we don't determine the regulatory response at the outset. We base the regulatory response on what is shown by the alternatives analysis, which is prepared by the manufacturer. So the manufacturers identify what the functional requirements are, what the alternative might be, and ultimately we make a decision based on the analysis. So as I mentioned, we're kind of in the second of these 4 steps, which is priority products. In the framework regulations that we're working under, there's 2 key prioritization principles that we need to make a determination on in order to decide to list something as a priority product. The first is that there be potential for exposure to a candidate chemical in whatever the product is, and secondly, that these exposures have the potential to either contribute to or cause significant or widespread adverse impacts. So it's a narrative standard. We don't have a threshold or a risk assessment in order to make that determination. It is just the words that you see here. As I mentioned, we had a public webinar in October of 2019. At that time, we released this document, which is our public background document on food packaging with PFASs, and this sort of lays out the basis for what we're talking about today, the scientific and regulatory criteria that we used to determine that this was something that we needed to talk about, and that's why we're here today. And today what I'd like to do is I'm going to sort of give you an overview of some of the information in the public background document. I'm going to talk first about definitions, what we're talking about when we say food packaging, what we're talking about when we say PFASs. I want to talk a bit about the potential for exposure to PFASs from food packaging, the potential adverse impacts from that exposure, and then finally a little bit about potential alternatives, which we'll get into in the panel discussions in more detail. So in the public background document, when we say food packaging, we're talking about any product containing PFASs placed into commerce in California, marketed or sold for making paper, paperboard, or molded fiber resistant to oil, grease, and water, or for releasing molded fiber food packaging from the formation molds. So this is our working definition of food packaging. As far as PFASs, we're talking about any member of the class of PFASs. I mentioned the 23 authoritative lists that make up our candidate chemicals list. One of those is the priority chemicals list for Biomonitoring California. Biomonitoring California's science guidance panel added the entire class of PFASs to the priority chemicals list in the latter part of 2015. And by doing that, the entire class of PFASs became candidate chemicals under our regulatory framework. So when we're talking about PFASs, we mean any member of this class that might be used in food packaging, as I talked about on the previous slide. So this is review for, I'm sure most of you. PFASs can be divided in different ways. Sort of the way we think about it, and then from Wong et al. Paper in 2017, the 4 sort of subclasses of PFASs include the perfluoroalkyl acids, which include well-known members such as PFOS and PFOA. Then there are, and many others. There are PFAA precursors, which are PFASs that either degrade or may metabolize to perfluoroalkyl acids, fluoropolymers, and perfluoropolyethers, which are the 4th class. So with regard to the use of members of this class in food packaging, there are currently 30 approved notifications for use of PFASs in food contact substances under the FDA FCN program. That really accounts for 19 distinct compositions, and there are 6 manufacturers that we're aware of. And these products are very common in California. There's some examples on this slide: bakery bags, deli wrappers, microwave popcorn bags. We'll hear a bit about that, I think, later today. And molded fiber food serviceware, things like bowls, soup containers, clamshells, things like that. So with regard to exposure potential, so we kind of, there are 30 approved FCNs. They're in a wide array of products that are ubiquitous. And as far as exposure from those products and other sources, we do know that PFASs are ubiquitous in the environment. They've been detected in environmental samples and biota collected around the world, even at the farthest corners of the world, far from any industrial activity or human population. So they're ubiquitous in the environment. They're found in plants and animals and humans, and in our food and drinking water. In addition to exposure directly from consuming food that has been packaged or served in food packaging, there are other routes by which PFASs can expose people or environmental receptors through migration from landfills, composting, landfill leachate, and through recycling of PFAS-containing products. As far as adverse impacts, in our framework regulations, we cite OEHA's regulations, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments regulations that define the hazard traits that we look at. Any chemical of concern we identify, we need to identify what its hazard traits are. And those regulations include what are called exposure potential hazard traits. And in and of themselves, these are reason for concern. And for the members of the class of PFASs, we think all of them have at least one of these environmental exposure potential hazard traits, which include environmental persistence, mobility, and bioaccumulation. And then another concern is, a serious concern is that PFASs are passed on to our most vulnerable population, fetuses and infants, through the lactational and transplacental transfer. So the exposure potential for PFAS is well documented. As far as hazard traits, all the members of this class are not well characterized. The best characterized are the longer chain PFAAs. Their hazard traits can include carcinogenicity, cardiovascular toxicity, endocrine, immuno, and reproductive toxicity. The shorter chain, 6 carbon or less PFASs, have a range of hazard traits that can include developmental, endocrine, hematotoxicity, and the other ones shown on this slide. So I mentioned on the earlier slide that if you take into account, if you look at the 4 subclasses, they include the PFAAs and the PFAA precursors, fluoropolymers, and perfluoropolyethers. Basically, this slide kind of shows that all roads lead to or from perfluoroalkyl acids. So they can degrade or metabolize. So like fluorotelomere-based substances can degrade to PFAAs. The perfluoropolyethers can combust and form PFAAs. PFAAs are used to manufacture perfluoropolyethers. And similarly, the polymers can combust to and are manufactured from PFAAs and can contain PFAA impurities. In fact, this OECD report found that of 5,000 or so PFASs, about 80%, over 80% can degrade to PFAAs. So in summary, we're concerned about potential adverse impacts to sensitive subpopulations, to endangered species, and to sensitive habitats from PFAAs coming from a variety of sources, including food packaging. As far as alternatives are concerned, there are a variety of ways of approaching alternatives to using these chemicals. One is using alternative materials to the fibers that are used to make the materials that are coated or use PFASs. Another is to change the processing methods, use different kinds of coatings, or use chemical barriers to prevent the oil or between the PFASs, I guess. As I mentioned, we put out this public background document in October, and we're now reaching the end of our public comment period. We are accepting comments until 11:59 p.m. tonight via our CalSafer web portal. So if you haven't already submitted your comments, I'm hopeful that this isn't the first you're hearing of it, since this document's been out for a few months. Please submit your comments by 11:59 p.m. tonight. And I think without further ado, I'll give it back to Asha, and we can get on with the next speaker and the panel discussions.
I have a few minutes for questions. If we have any from the audience, we can take questions. We can come to you with a mic. Questions? Okay, in that case, let's go ahead and thank Mr. Alghazi for the presentation. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Carla Ng is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on predicting the biological fate and potential hazards of PFASs. She develops models to better understand the fate and transport of legacy and emerging chemicals, and also studies the cascading benefits of green infrastructure networks. Please welcome Dr. Carla Ng.
Okay, so those first two talks were really teed this up nicely, so I'll be able to gloss over some slides. And just to preface this a little bit, this is not going to be a research talk. This is more a little bit of an overview talk, but I will touch upon kind of how a scientist approaches these questions and what we do and don't know, and what we see as our role in helping to provide kind of guidance for a scientifically sound policy, I would say. So as we've already talked about, PFAS can enter our food through many different routes. And one of the challenges we have is in really understanding, what is the main issue for human exposure to PFAS. So we know that if you live in a community with contaminated water, drinking water is going to be your primary source of PFAS exposure. If you're outside of one of those communities, it's thought that food is your primary route of PFAS exposure. In addition to that, we also have the indoor route, which is still sort of poorly characterized in ongoing research. But we all understand that food is an important route, and of course, we all want safe food. And so it's an area of concern for communities and scientists. And I'm going to speak specifically about packaging today, even though that's not my normal area of research. I've been studying PFAS for some time now. The years keep going by. But I'm kind of an application agnostic researcher. So I'm interested in looking at the PFAS structure and understanding how it behaves, but not necessarily focusing on a particular application. As has already been discussed, PFAS is used in food contact materials in a lot of different ways, directly in packaging, which is I think the focus for today, but also more indirectly in other things such as in the food processing industry, in materials that are used that are in contact with food, and even more esoteric applications like in greasers and oils to keep the moving parts in the machinery running. And so trying to get a handle of all of those uses of PFAS can be challenging. So when we're thinking about PFAS in food packaging, and really any chemical in food packaging, there are three essential things that we need to understand. We need to know how the chemical will transfer from packaging to food, so the migration behavior. We need to understand how or whether it'll transform within the packaging itself or within the food once migration has occurred. Is the chemical staying with the same identity as it was first put into the packaging material? And very important, whether it's going to be bioavailable, bioaccumulative, and or bioactive. And all of these will depend on the identity and properties of the PFAS in question, of course. This seems really logical, but that's kind of a challenge, right? So we don't necessarily have a lot of information about the identity and, importantly, the concentration of PFAS that are used in a lot of applications. And I speak as a scientist who just kind of goes on the internet to try and figure out what's been published and what's available for public consumption, right? So which PFAS are used in food packaging? A lot of the PFAS have already been discussed today in general are those that are used for what's called sizing of materials. So as you're trying to make paper grease-proof, this could be as a coating on the surface of the paper. It could be impregnated throughout the paper fibers. So that figure just kind of shows an impregnated paper and what that looks like. The problem from the scientific perspective, somebody like me trying to say, okay, what are the properties of these chemicals, is really that it's difficult to find public information about specific chemical structures and composition. There is this FDA inventory of food contact substance notifications, so these FCNs, that will be discussed further today. But if you've ever, I'm sure a lot of you have, looked at these, this is what one of these looks like. So if I go to the website and I look up, okay, what kind of notifications are there for food contact materials? The food contact substance is given up there. So I have a PhD. I have a background in chemical engineering. I study environmental engineering now. That does not jump out at me, and I look at that sentence and go, oh, I know what that does. It's very opaque, right? And so it's useful if we can actually see what a chemical structure looks like. So I understand that we're going to have a couple of talks after me. There will be a specific presentation talking about this EDF FOIA request that was able to find some of these more detailed information about specific FCNs. So I'm not going to get into the source of these documents, but I will just point out what I see as a scientist looking at some of these structures. So these are three different FCNs that I downloaded from that EDF site. And all of these are what we call side chain fluorinated polymers. I think this is important to think about because in the overview we were just given about PFAS, there's been a lot of focus on PFAAs, these perfluoroalkyl acids, because that's what a lot of things break down into. That's what we know the properties of. But there's also a lot of conversation right now about whether fluoropolymers should be considered like other PFAS. There's a little bit of a push to consider them as less problematic because they're supposed to be persistent and not break down. Side chain fluorinated polymers in particular are the ones that we know do break down. And so if you're trying to figure out how to look at this structure, just know that the backbone is a normal polymer backbone, non-fluorinated, and they have these side chains that stick out, some of which contain a fluorotelomere group on it. So there are fully fluorinated carbons, there are partially or non-fluorinated carbons, and what's going to happen is at that non-fluorinated carbon, those groups are going to break off, and that's how you get PFAAs entering into the environment or potentially into the food from this polymer material. So here just is one of the examples, FCN 1676, and you can see that that has a C6F13 group there. So when that breaks off, you're basically going to have a hexafluorinated acid that forms. And so this is, as I said, a side chain fluorinated polymer. And there's this argument that fluoropolymers are substances of low concern because they're not bioavailable based on the monomer size, but not based on the size of these substances that break off. So even if we accept the argument for the polymer itself, there are ways for these smaller substances to migrate into food, either through residual monomer. This is something that should be taken care of in the FCN, through the migration of impurities, or through the degradation of the polymer and subsequent migration into food. And then once this migrates into food, there should be some measure of what is the exposure that could result from this. So most of these submitted FCNs will exclude migration studies because what they say instead is, let's assume the worst case scenario. We're going to be extra vigilant and say we're just going to do the worst case and just assume that it's the low molecular weight oligomers that are left over and impurities, and all of those are going to be migrating into the food. And my question, looking at this critically, is that actually a worst case assumption? Because stability testing, to understand whether these break down or not, usually only take into account heating of the food contact material. They don't think about what are the properties of the food it's in contact with that might interact with the chemicals that are there. And the exposure estimation only takes into account the low molecular weight oligomers and the impurities and not any potential degradation products. So if we know that side chain fluorinated polymers may degrade, that's not taken into account in these calculations. Furthermore, at least for some of them, it would appear that the detection limits for the low molecular weight oligomers are not that high. So given what we are now seeing as what we think of as concentrations of concern for PFAS, are those detection limits low enough to catch them? And there are recent data emerging, and even not all that recent, 2014, which is now, 6 years ago, show that side chain fluorinated polymers do degrade in the environment. So this is a study looking at the amount of analyte, and you can see here that you have your precursors, and then these are the breakdown products from this polymer here that are appearing in soil after a few months' time, and as you can see, these go up. The big spike here, that's PFOA, certainly of concern. And this will occur in soil on the order of months. So it's not fast. The question is, what happens if you have food that's packaged, that's sitting on the shelf for a while? Can you expect to see any of this degradation occur there as well? This is another study that was looking specifically at fluoropolymers used in clothing, but again, they saw substantial opportunity for degradation. This is a paper from 2019. So would this also happen for food contact materials? Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear? Was I just holding it too low? Sorry about that. And so we know that there is a potential for human exposure to materials from food contact materials because we see it in biomonitoring, right? So this is a study that came out just last year in Environmental Health Perspectives, showing a correlation between an increase in PFAS serum concentrations versus typical types of food consumption habits. So consumption of fast food or food not prepared in the home, and that this was corrected against whether there are specific foods that tend to have higher concentrations of PFAS through environmental accumulation. So really pointed out that consumption of fast food and specifically consumption of popcorn was associated with increases in serum PFAS. So it's more associated with where food is being consumed, that is at restaurants or from packaged foods, than which food is being consumed. And so that points to the point in the food cycle where PFAS are entering and might be causing exposure. So one of the other issues with this, especially as we think about the degradation of materials, is that we have this potential of causing this forever loop, right? So it enters into the packaging, might enter into the food from the packaging, causing direct exposure, but then once that packaging is disposed of, there's a potential for additional entry into the food system when materials such as compost and biosolids are used in agricultural applications. And so we've seen stories like this popping up again and again. Here is a particular sad story in Maine about a farm that applied biosolids from a pulp and paper mill years ago, and after 15 years there, the milk was so severely tainted that you could no longer sell it, and basically the farm is lost. So because keeping in mind this idea about the slow degradation of side chain fluorinated polymers, are we kind of making ourselves a little time bomb where the slow polymer degradation and high persistence of the products could represent a near constant source for legacy contamination of the environment? So what can we do? That's kind of depressing. We should think about this from a life cycle perspective, of course, especially thinking about things like polymers. We need to think about the production side, the use side, and the disposal side. We need to understand what constituents are going to be released from a material when it's manufactured, when it's integrated into products, while it's being used, and when it's disposed of. And if we want to quantify risk, which is what a lot of us want to be able to do, we want to be able to prioritize and use our resources wisely, we need to know the quantity and identity of all the chemicals involved. And I know that there are different levels of interaction at which this happens. So sometimes governments are privy to information that the public is not privy to, but definitely there needs to be some sort of agreed upon data sharing so that we as scientists can help in designing models that can help predict the risk of these substances. And of course, even while we're trying to reduce our uncertainty, we really need to be able to find safer alternatives. And so just a couple of words about this, since I'm not going to get deep into it, but it's something that I do. It's my bread and butter is developing models to predict the properties of PFAS. So we develop models to help predict whether and why they bioaccumulate. We do a lot of prediction of protein interactions with PFAS and subsequent tissue distribution. We're starting to make models of PFAS bioactivity. So I have a recent application using machine learning to try to find which PFAS are bioactive just for kind of large-scale screening of many thousands of substances. And then we do some more detailed tissue-level models to understand the toxicokinetics of these substances, so we know which ones are going to stick around in the body and may have a chance to have bioactivity. And these models are really useful because they can really help to screen and prioritize substances when we don't have any experimental data, and then say, okay, these look kind of nasty, let's go and try and get experimental data for these to confirm what we see. And then beyond the models, I've been working with a group of international scientists to kind of think about ways that we can move forward, even in the absence of total surety, which we will never have about anything. And we've been talking a lot recently about this essential use concept, which we think can be very powerful in moving forward. So we need to think about, what separates substances that are kind of non-essential, that are there because they are kind of cool, they impart something, but the function that it imparts is not essential for the health, safety, or functioning of society. And so some of the examples we have here are, for example, the use of PFAS in dental floss. Substitutable, so these are uses that have become regarded as essential, but there are other alternatives available. Most uses of AFFF, certain water-resistant textiles, and I would say a lot of the paperboard. I think there's somebody here from Denmark who'll be talking about this, which is great because they've made huge steps forward in this, and I don't see why we can't follow their model. And then some of the essential uses for which there are currently no substitutes, but which we can think about now. This is where we should focus to find substitutes as quickly as possible. And for now, food contact materials are kind of in that 1, 2, or 3 zone, depending for which application we're talking about. And I just want to point out that in these FCN data that I looked through, they usually use this result of a kit test to give as a means to demonstrate the efficacy of fluorochemical treatment in paperboard. So they just have to show that it's really good at repelling oil and grease. How much do we need that? So efficacy is not the same as essentiality. So just because we have a substance that can make something have this function, we still need to ask ourselves, how much do we need this function? And is there something else that we can have that is not quite as good, but certainly good enough and doesn't pose the same risks? So I think that's the question that I think will be key for us to discuss today. And with that, I'd be happy to open up to questions or panel discussion later. Thanks.
Do you have time for questions? Do we have any questions from the audience today? Okay, great. Well, let's thank Dr. Carla Ng for the presentation. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Brian Cernulka is the Director of Government Relations for the Food Service Packaging Institute. Previously, he worked with regulatory agencies and policymakers while managing government affairs and sustainability at Graphic Packaging International. Please welcome Mr. Cernulka.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm a little bit of the opposite of what we just heard. I am not a chemist or a scientist. I started with the Food Service Packaging Institute in October of 2018. As you mentioned, I previously I came from the industry, though. I worked for a paper company for several years on sustainability and government affairs, but most of my career has been on government relations, working at all levels of government, and I'm certainly interested in this conversation because we're obviously we have a stake in how this is regulated and future policy that's going to be surrounding this as the debate kind of unfolds. I also went to Georgia State University, a master's in political science. I'll give you a little background on FPI. The Food Service Packaging Institute was established in 1933. It's the only trade association in North America that's solely focused on all single-use food service packaging products. We represent roughly 90% of the industry. We have several members here in the audience today too. But this is basically what our association does is we have the entire supply chain in our membership. So from the raw material, the person that's actually creating the item, to the converter, to we have an associate membership where the suppliers or the users of the products are actually members of our association too. So I think this is probably one of the most important pieces of this. What I want to bring to the talk today is following up on our introduction or on the introduction to the meeting was that we look forward to this collaboration. We look forward to being a part of this process, and what we can do as an association is really take this information back and deliver it to our members. And then when we need to, we can bring them into this discussion and have them part of whether it's specific examples or a discussion about the supply chain. I think that's going to be really important. Food service packaging, the items that we represent, it's basically everything you could possibly imagine on the single-use food service packaging side. So cups, plates, platters, bowls, trays, beverage carriers, bags, containers, lids, domes, wraps, straws, cutlery, utensils. Goes on and on. This is stuff that we use every day. This is stuff that is sanitary, it's cost-effective, safe, convenient, helps drive the economy. These are critical items that we all, I don't think we realize how much we actually use and as a part of our lives. So I think this is a great association that really covers all this stuff. I'm going to jump through this real quick because we've kind of already done the PFAS and what it is discussion. And like I said, I am specialized in government relations and not chemistry. But for us, we're looking at the applications for PFAS. So non-stick cookware, small appliances, repeat use food contact applications. So actually a good reference here is we saw some policy in the Northeast last year that would have been introduced, unintended consequences, where they were talking about specific packaging items. It actually would have brought up like the tubing and hoses that are used in soda machines. So trying to get Coke or anything like that, that would actually impact it because it does have a component of PFAS in it. Food processing equipment, Food wrappers, obviously paper molded fiber, serviceware, takeout, food containers, pizza boxes, popcorn bags, pet food containers. As we've kind of covered off already today, it prevents oil and grease from seeping through food packaging materials and onto clothing, skin, furniture, car, interiors, etc. I mean, you realize what a to-go based, on-the-road, fast-driven economy that we have in this country, and consumers rely on these products to not leak grease into their car, on them, or especially if you imagine being like a traveling salesman or something like that. I mean, you're eating on the road a lot. You're using these products on a day-to-day basis, and you rely on them to be convenient and safe and perform to the degree that you're not having some sort of issue with this. We've talked about this a little bit already today, but I will say that on the long chain materials that we had talked about here earlier, PFOA and PFOS, these were voluntarily phased out, no longer used in the US and Canada, though I do believe some countries still allow it. So really what we're here is to talk about the short chain chemicals. These chemicals are approved by the FDA and Health Canada. For us in association, we cover the US and Canada. That's why I continue to mention Canada, plus many other regulatory agencies around the world. The FDA process, FDA requires pre-market review of food contact substances, including data on chemical composition, levels of the substances that may be released under intended use conditions and the resulting potential dietary concentrations, toxicity data on the substance, including all impurities and degradation of the products. I think we kind of saw a little bit of that in the last presentation, so I'll move on quickly here. Again, I think the biggest point to take away from this is that FDA does do a rigorous process to review these products, and they are approved. And right now, today, there's less than 3 dozen PFAS chemicals that are allowed by the FDA in the US. So when you see that big chart that says, 5,000 different chemicals, when we're talking about food packaging, we're talking about a much smaller subset, something that's typically never mentioned in the media articles or anything else. But that is really where we're trying to focus in on the discussion for food packaging. So right now, again, I want to kind of go back to the FDA. So FDA actually put out a statement earlier this year on PFAS substances. There's a lot of material available on their website. Certainly we'll reference you back to the Flora Council on their collection of scientific studies that they have around PFAS substances that are currently allowed in food packaging today. And they right now present no significant risks to consumers. Using FDA's methodology for calculating the dietary intake, the maximum levels of PFAS used in food packaging today, 13 times lower than estimated safe levels, meaning that the specific PFAS substances approved by FDA for the use in food packaging pose no appreciable risk to human health or the environment. This statement came from FDA itself in June of 2019. It's available online, something that our industry follows by. Some things that we just wanted to point out, again, this gets back to that big, large number that is referenced constantly, treating all PFAS chemicals the same. That's not the way to approach this discussion. I mean, we're talking about, less than 2 dozen chemicals that are actually in food packaging, not the reference to 5,000. And then certainly looking at the FDA approval process, FDA's approval process is one of the most stringent in the entire world. The US consistently has one of the safest food supplies in the entire world. And this is in part due to this approval process and looking through the chemicals that we've submitted. So the Food Service and Packaging Institute put out a position on PFAS last year. FPI supports the continued use of FDA-reviewed and approved PFAS in food service packaging. FPI also recognizes that alternatives may be introduced to replace PFAS, and both should be able to compete in a free and open marketplace. So we have more information on this that's found on our website. This was just recently updated and put out last year by our board. And I just wanted to kind of run through a few other brief comments that we had on things that we see as an industry that continues to be brought up. Right now that we don't see a great consistent test method, I guess, is probably the best way to say it, is that look at it and how it's consistently tested. A lot of the articles that you will see will be testing for the presence of fluorine in the environment, but not specifically down to these 13 exact chemicals that are used in food service packaging items. So a lot of the articles can be misleading around exactly what they're looking for, how they're testing, and the chemicals that are under discussion. The presence of fluorine does not mean the presence of PFAS, and certainly doesn't show the type of PFAS. So again, a lot of the media attention around this is getting caught up in this larger conversation, but not down to the specific details that are related to food service packaging items. We know of certainly a lot that are out there in the industry, Notre Dame, Iowa State, some others that are putting together some of the testing programs that are around this. And you certainly look at, from a policy perspective, each state that is working on this issue is certainly looking at different ways for testing and trying to find the presence for it, which at the end of the day is going to make an inconsistent marketplace and a difficult supply chain for large manufacturers of food service packaging items. This is my contact information. I really am looking forward to the panel discussion because I think we can kind of get into some of the more specifics around this. And again, I think one of the biggest thing is, talking about the supply chain and how this is actually, these products are actually produced and entered into the marketplace. I think it's going to be a really big component to how it could potentially be regulated at the statewide level, certainly. So right now, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If I don't have the answer to the question, we can find it. We'll get back to you and try to get you the answers on the questions. Appreciate the time.
We are ahead of schedule, so if we have any questions for Mr. Cernulka, we'd like to go ahead and see first if we have anyone from the audience. And if not, okay, we've got one.
Hi, Brian. It's Carl Palmer from the Safer Consumer Products Program. First, thanks for being here and sharing with us your perspective. I have a general question. We've seen in different industries with similar type challenges, industry trade organizations getting together and actually being somewhat proactive about making a commitment to move to safer chemistries and looking at alternatives. And I would point to the apparel industry in this space, which is started with restricted substances lists and then has I think made a broader commitment to move forward. Can you speak a little bit about what FPI is doing in terms of being proactive, in terms of looking at the challenges in this class, and can we expect to see something out of you in that regard rather than being sort of reactive?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. As an industry, yes, that's what we want to do. Is we want to pull all the stakeholders to the table and have this discussion. I think the problem is you're seeing. This is a great example on the testing side, is you see a lot of different groups, BPI and others related to composting, that are kind of going different directions on this and how they regulate it, how they address it, how they test it. So trying to pull some of that together as an industry is going to be important, and it's something that we're currently having internal discussions on. So, like I said, we've put out a statement in 2019 that really kind of sums up our position on this, but it will continue to evolve and grow as the industry continues to have this discussion. So, as we sit, we represent, roughly 90% of the industry. That is, that's where this discussion's unfolding at right now, and I think you will probably see some new things that come out around it in the future. But again, it's just, something that just hasn't been totally discussed or worked out yet for a lot of the groups. So I think that's something that we're working on right now. And certainly we want to try to pull everybody together, because if we all go different directions, it's going to make it really difficult on the supply chain, a national supply chain.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Hey, thank you so much for the presentation, Mr. Cernulka. We do have one more speaker before the break who will be presenting remotely, so bear with us. Dr. Marisol Maffini specializes in researching carcinogenesis, reproductive biology, and endocrine disruption. She has spent the past 9 years conducting research on the U.S. Food Additive Regulatory Program with an emphasis on food chemicals, risk assessment, and science policy. We'll leave some time for discussion with Ms. Maffini after the presentation, since she won't be able to join us on the panel discussion this afternoon. Are you ready for us, Dr. Maffini?
Yes, can you hear me? And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Can you see my screen?
Dr. Maffini, yes, we can see your screen.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you this morning. I apologize, I had plans to be there in person, but life got on the way. And I played some tricks with me this weekend on health-related issues. But I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this workshop. And today I'm going to share with you some of the information we learned from a Freedom of Information Act request to the Food and Drug Administration regarding the use of PFAS in contact with food. So first of all, this is my disclosure. I work with public interest organizations, with the private sector. I was a co-author of a petition to FDA to ban long-chain perfluorinated chemicals, and that was accepted in 2016. And this work in particular was done in collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund, but in this talk, the preparation of the talk and the opinions are my own. So very briefly here, since Carla and Brian discussed this already, but I just want to make sure we are all on the same page, that PFAS can be used in contact with food because, one, the FDA approved the uses as in the regulations, or manufacturers determine that the use of that particular PFAS is generally recognized as safe. And this doesn't mean that the manufacturer have to tell the FDA what they are doing. It doesn't have to go to the FDA for safety review. They can just bypass it and use it based on their own declaration. And of course, we don't know anything about the substances, the identity, the uses, and their safety. And the third one, that is the one I'm going to focus today because is the basis of our FOIA request, is the Food Contact Notification Program that is based on the review by the agency of a safety assessment submitted by manufacturers to the agency. The agency reviews that, prepare an opinion, and then publishes its decision on a website that is the inventory that Carla already showed you how it looks like. This is again another caption. It has a search box where if you write the word fluoro, it will come up with 70 records. And then if you click on any of the numbers under the column FCN number, it will lead you to this page. As I said, Carla mentioned this already and show you, but I just wanted to stress a couple of things to highlight the kind of the opacity of the program. We can figure out the intended uses, and we can figure out the limitations and specifications of uses of the food contact substance, but that is pretty much it. For instance, the limitation of this substance by the company Daikin, it can be used up to 1% in the dry fiber. So these are, not very small amounts, but just to show you what FDA is looking at. So because of the lack of information in the public domain, we submitted this FOIA request for 31 food contact notifications that had a clear description that the uses were in contact with food. These were 19 distinct chemical mixtures, mostly polymers, 14 of which were used to coat paper and cardboard. Others were used for making gaskets and other pieces of manufacturing equipment. This covers 6 chemical companies. We received thousands and thousands of pages Many of them were greatly redacted. But we got visibility into some of the information submitted to the agency when it comes to the quality and the quantity of the information the manufacturer submitted. But also, it was important to figure out, to get visibility into the agency's reasoning for some of the decisions that they made. So today, I'm going to focus only on the chemistry and exposure aspect of the response. As you can see on the right-hand side, the form is called 3480. That is the food content notification. That is all the information that the manufacturers have to submit. And then FDA prepare reviews and memos for each of these three pieces: the environmental, toxicology, and chemistry and exposure. So just for the sake of time, these are the 7 different sections within the chemistry information. I'm going to focus today on the identity, the impurities, migration, and exposure estimates. Again, this is something that Carla already mentioned, but this is the type of information that you can see that is submitted from by the manufacturers. What I have here in boxes are some of the names of the monomers, the PFAS monomers that are used. And in some cases, the information is provided in many different ways, some I think in a graphic way, and some others just like very long formulas. This is another example of more detailed information that we collected in a few cases where that was not redacted. So this is, for instance, a description of what the commercial polymer is. That in this case of the Acroma product is approximately 18% polymer and 80% impurities and reagents. And in the Asahi product is 15% polymer, and the rest are expected reagents and impurities. And this is important. It will come. It will be more important later on in the talk. But this is just the few cases where we have more visibility. So other issues that, or other information that companies have to provide is the list of all the ingredients, the monomers, the solvents, everything that is used to make these polymers. And as you can see here, the red box is coming from FDA. It's not my, all my boxes are green. And you see on the left-hand side, marked there with a green arrow is the PFAS monomer. But also they have to describe whether or not there will be a residue expected to remain in the final paper or cardboard. And as you can see here, there are, in 3 cases, there will be a residue. This is something that FDA already published in 2013 in their own research, looking at commercial papers. So on the left-hand side, the second column is the concentration of the polymers on the 2 different polymers on the paper, and on the right-hand side, between the dotted lines, are the concentration of PFAS monomers that FDA found in those papers. So residues are there and in different ways. So this is just a list of the PFAS monomers that we got from the FOIA response. I don't expect you to memorize this, but I wanted to show you that there are different synonyms. And when you look at the FOIA papers, it is incredible how they change the names with time. Some things that used to be something demonstrated that have 13 fluoros suddenly became a C6, X, Y, and Z. So there's an evolution also in the way that companies name their products. In addition to the reagents, the initial ingredients, they have to provide a list of impurities. In most cases, again, is redacted. That is important for the manufacturer to not disclose that information because it gives information about the manufacturing process, that is what they are protecting. But in one particular case, somebody forgot to redact this, and we have some visibility here on a long list of impurities for this particular food contact substance, that is food contact notification 518 from Chemours. Everything that is within those green boxes are PFAS. So you have oligomers, you have a great variety of impurities that the company described are present. Again, regarding the impurities, they have to demonstrate whether or not they will migrate from the final product into the food. And in this case, there are here, I forgot to box one at the end, but there are 7 impurities that will be that will migrate into the food. And this is again from the same 2013 FDA researchers paper, again demonstrated that there is migration of PFAS from 2 different food packaging materials into food simulants, representing in this case acidic and fatty foods. This is another example demonstrating that there is migration from a variety of PFAS. This is a research group in China, and the migration efficiencies for this particular PFAS will depend on the length of the carbon chain, as well as the composition of the food. So that's why you have different results in each of the different columns. And this was a study performed in paper bowls. So because there are residues in the paper, in the final product, and there is migration, the manufacturers need to estimate what the exposure would be. Again, the red boxes are not mine. That came from the FOIA. And in many cases here you can see the values, but in only a couple of cases you see those values, the estimated daily intake or the dietary concentrations associated with chemicals. All the other impurities here, we have an exposure estimate, but we don't know what they are. So that was very common. In many cases, so actually we didn't even have visibility into the numbers. So this is a particular case from Food Contact Notification 820, where they have this table with the exposure estimate for the impurities. I want to call your attention to the reflection that FDA wrote in a memo, saying that these exposure estimates are vanishingly small. I was just surprised to see that qualification coming from a regulator, but it was interesting to see how they reason whether or not these exposures can actually have any particular biological effect. So that reasoning that the exposures are very small is pretty much what is then informing the toxicology review that the agency does. So the main focus of the toxicity testing or the toxicity information that needs to be submitted to the agency is whether or not there is genotoxicity, either the monomer or for the monomer or the impurities. Then basically the toxicology session reviewers are looking at what the exposure estimates are, and in most cases the conclusion is that, as I copied here at the bottom, toxicology has no questions regarding the safety of proposed use of the food contact substance based on the exposure estimates and the toxicological evaluation of the data. That is, in most cases, just genotoxicity and mutagenesis testing. So what have we learned from the FOIA request? And here I want to just highlight a few what I see as shortcomings from FDA's reasoning. that safety is driven by the exposure estimates. So if the PFAS monomer is not a genotoxic, then the oligomers are also assumed not to be genotoxic, with a dietary concentration of less than 50 parts per billion of the monomer or the low molecular weight oligomers. The assumption is that there is no safety concern. And just to make sure, the 50 parts per billion in the diet corresponds to 150 micrograms of PFAS per person per day. These are estimates for each individual food contact substance. These are not as grouped in any way. And that the toxicity testing, again, other than genotoxicity assays, they are very rare for PFAS monomers or even oligomers, even when they know that they remain in the final product and they migrate. So other shortcomings are the fact that all these food contact substances are usually, the monomers are the so-called short chains, so they are 6 carbons or less. And the assumption is that they don't bioaccumulate. We didn't find any information on the thousands of pages where companies submitted data on bioaccumulation. There aren't any estimates of collective or cumulative exposure through the diet that include other PFAS in not only in food contact packaging, but also environmental contamination. And this is important because FDA's responsibility by law, this is in the statute of the Food Additives Amendment of 1958, the FDA has to assess the cumulative effects of chemically and pharmacologically related substances in the diet, basically taking a class approach. And this has not been done, as far as I can tell, by FDA in a consistent manner. So again, this is to show you on the left-hand side are the PFAS monomers that were allowed by FDA to be used in food contact materials. And on the right-hand side is this list of PFAS that FDA has tested in the last few years, and they published, as Brian mentioned, first in June, and then there was another publication in the last month. So none of these, as you can see, they don't coincide. So what FDA is testing in food to figure out human exposures are environmental contaminants. They are not testing so far for PFAS that they have approved to be used in contact with food. So there is a disconnect there. And with that, I think I skipped one. Yeah, here. Just to summarize, that the agency has the position that low exposures are of no concern. We are lacking estimates of cumulative exposures to PFAS in the diet. If the agency doesn't want to look at environmental sources of these PFAS, they should be looking at the PFAS that are allowed to be in packaging, and they are in the diet. We are not eating one of them at a time. Again, toxicity testing beyond genotoxicity is lacking. There is no information about bioaccumulation or how the body deals with this monomers and even the oligomers. There's nothing on the short chain, the low molecular weight oligomers, and it's unclear how they determine the size of the oligomers. Again, there's unclear, to me at least, what the rationale for some of the assumptions are. Analytical methods to measure these PFAS are also lacking, and just FDA approved another PFAS for using food contact a few months ago. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maffini. We do encourage you to ask questions of Dr. Maffini since she won't be joining us for the panel discussion. We want to make sure that those of you joining us by webcast, if you have any questions for the speaker, please email saferconsumerproducts@dtsc.ca.gov. We'll go ahead and start. Do we have any questions in the audience?
Hi, Dr. Maffini. This is Andre Algazi at DTSC.
Hi.
In the table, you are showing the PFASs that that were being analyzed by in the material, and those are not the same ones that were listed as contaminants on the FCN. Do I understand correctly? Is that what you were when you spoke about the disconnect?
No. On the left-hand side, where the list of the PFAS that were approved to be used in packaging, and on the right-hand side are the PFAS that FDA has been testing in food. Food from retail or from farmers markets, and for instance, they are running what is called a total diet study. That is something that the agency has done for many decades. They buy foods in different retail locations. This one specifically was in the mid-Atlantic. And then, let's say they buy 3 different cereals, the same kind of cereal, they mix it together, and from that composite, then they measure PFAS. The PFAS that they chose to measure are not those that they approved for use in food contact materials.
Thank you, I understand that.
All right.
Thank you. We have another question over here. If you don't mind stating your...
Hi, this is Tom Bruton with the Green Science Policy Institute. Thank you, Dr. Maffini, for the presentation. My question is...
Hi, Tom.
Hi. Based on what we know about the toxicology of PFAS, does it make sense to you that genotoxicity is the main metric that FDA is using in these reviews?
It should be complemented with other toxicity testing. There are no dietary exposures that I could see. There were a couple of studies submitted that FDA dismissed. They didn't consider they were technically correct. Both, I think, were 14 days oral dietary exposures for the monomers, and in some cases was just they actually fed the polymer to the rats, and FDA sort of figured out that they were of low quality. What we found was that one of the companies, Daikin, had dietary exposure studies done. So they have run, I believe it was either a 28-day feeding study or a 90-day feeding study. I'm not sure what the duration was. But in both cases, well, first of all, they never submitted that information to FDA. And in both cases, they saw liver damage, they saw kidney damage, and they saw tooth damage in the rats. We found those studies in the company's website. They have, in their attempt to be transparent, they had listed many of the studies they have done. And when we had some conversations with them about that, and then they realized that that was a mistake, and they took that out. The website, you can't find it anymore. But you can find it with the Wayback Machine. In any case, some information is available. Unfortunately, was not submitted to the agency, and what was submitted to the agency considered of low quality. So there is a lot that should be done, since we know that these are multi-organ toxicants, and they are acting at extremely low levels, and we know very, very, very little.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a question from the webcast.
So this question is from one of our online attendees, Pat Rizzuto from Bloomberg Environment. She's wondering, even if you don't know the impurities in food packaging fluoropolymers, has your research suggested any differences in the amount of impurities in the PFAS used for low-value paper applications versus other products, such as high-value fluoropolymer uses in semiconductors or other high-tech purposes?
Oh, I am not a chemist or a chemical engineer. Maybe Carla can help me with that information. When we looked at that notifications, the FCNs that were for uses in gaskets, for instance, for manufacturing equipment, I think most of them, if not all, were submitted by Chemours. And in their assessment of migration, it was basically null. They didn't see anything coming out from that particular use and in the way the PFAS was used and manufactured. So that was different kind of material, was not paper and cardboard. That is the extent of the information I can provide to Pat.
Was it also a different polymer, like of fluoropolymer where the fluorine is in the carbon chain, in the backbone of the polymer, as opposed to a side chain fluorinated polymer?
There was a lot of reduction.
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hey, Maricel, this is Daphne Mullen from CalRecycle, and I have two questions. Hi, I have two questions for you. In the FOIA evaluation that you did, in the statement about very small levels of exposure, do they consider a cumulative exposure in their evaluation? And then my second question is about end of life, and if the FDA evaluation of having these chemicals in the products, do they only look at like the use of the product from the direct consumer, or do they consider the full life cycle and consider what may happen from, say, composting or recycling of those paper products?
I will start with the last one, and no, they only look at the safety of the intended uses. So, for instance, you will see that the same polymer, there are two food content notifications, different numbers submitted at different times, but they are for the exact same polymer. And that could be that the first one was submitted for uses in paper and paperboard, but not microwave uses. And the second one was for also microwave uses. So every time they change the use, they have to submit a food content notification to the agency. It's not an obligation, but they usually do that. In the same way, there are several notifications that have they have the same polymers, the same monomers, but there are different notifications because they change the manufacturing process. And they continue to change the manufacturing process to reduce the number and the type of impurities. So every time they change the manufacturing process, they should inform the agency. But the safety that FDA looks at is just about the use of that is reported to them. They are not looking at life cycle. For cumulative exposures, I haven't seen any of that. There are memos written by FDA scientists indicating a list of other food content notifications that were either for the same polymers or very similar polymers and monomers that could be considered under the same class when you're looking at them from the chemical structure perspective. In one case, there were like 5 different ones, and FDA said these are related chemicals, but they didn't do a cumulative exposure for those. And in addition to that, the mandate to the agency is to do the cumulative exposure of chemicals in the diet. So if you have PFOA coming as an impurity from packaging into the food, and you have PFOA from water contamination, both are part of the diet, and those should be considered together. But that is not the case. Did I answer your questions?
Yes, great. Thank you.
One more question from the audience.
Great, thanks. Hi, Dr. Muffini. It's Kathy Rudisil from SRC. I had a question about the total diet study that you compared to the approved monomers. And the total diet study the FDA does, are they testing some of the foods that are used at high heat, high fat foods that tend to increase the potential for food migration? Or are they more of the sort of retail shelf type products?
No, this is a very broad group of foods. They test everything. They test fish and meat and poultry and yogurt and dairy and pasta and even not just things that you buy at the grocery store that are in a package, but they also buy from restaurants. There was that they do chocolate cakes and ice cream and produce, fresh produce and canned fruits and fresh fruits, and it's a big variety of foods.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? You want to go ahead and answer? Okay. All right. In that case, we'll check again with the webcast. Do we have any questions from the webcast? Okay. In that case, that takes us to the break. We will reconvene in about a little bit more than 15 minutes, let's say 10:45, and begin our morning panel discussion. So see you then.
Thank you all.
Hey, welcome back from break, everyone. Now we're going to get started with our panel discussion on the life cycle of food and food packaging products containing PFASs. I'll start with introductions from the far left and then introduce our moderators at the end. So on the left, Brian, if you could wave, we've already met Brian Cernulka, who's the Director of Government Relations for the Food Service Packaging Institute. Next, we have Dr. Carla Ng, who's Assistant Professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Next to her, we have Daphne Moline, who's a supervisor at Cal Recycle with 10 years of experience implementing chemical regulations. She oversees a unit focused on the end of life of plastic materials and developing regulations that require food service facilities to use packaging that is reusable, recyclable, or compostable. Her unit is also engaged in evaluating innovative recycling processes, the compostability and degradability of new materials, and the impacts of plastic materials. Ms. Moline, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Sure, thank you. I think that was a pretty good, kind of fast summary. Yes, I was at DTSC for 10 years and recently moved to Cal Recycle as a supervisor, formerly with the Safer Consumer Products Program. So I'm well versed in the types of questions Simona will be asking us. Also, as my unit in Cal Recycle, we focus on plastic recycling and issues that relate to that. So we have some upcoming regulations that will be coming out that also address food service packaging, thinking about the reusability, recyclability, and compostability of those. And then woven into that is consideration for impacts to public health and to wildlife. So we put out regulations last year, and PFAS are a consideration in that. And then the other element that my unit works on that kind of relates to this area is when we think about compostable plastics, it's a really complicated landscape, especially for consumers not understanding the distinction between the words. So there's a state law about how those types of products can be labeled, and Cal Recycle got some funding from some settlements from the district attorneys and some product manufacturers about their products. And so we're using some of that funding to evaluate total fluorine in compostable products, if they get into compost and into compost leachate. And then the researchers are also looking into possible remediation approaches as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to skip over our moderators for the moment, and then next to them, if you don't mind waving, we've got Jen Jackson, who manages the Toxics Reduction and Healthy Ecosystems Program at the San Francisco Department of the Environment. Ms. Jackson's team has led several initiatives to reduce the demand for PFASs, including legislation to ban PFASs in single-use food service ware in San Francisco. Ms. Jackson, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Sure, thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay? So in San Francisco in 2018, we passed legislation that bans the use of fluorinated chemicals in takeout food serviceware. And that actually is grounded in work that we did in our own purchases. So we run 2 hospital cafeterias. And when we found out that perhaps some of the products that we were purchasing for takeout food serviceware might contain fluorinated chemicals, we decided to investigate. We did some testing, and we found that about 40% of the products that we were purchasing did have fluorinated chemicals, and about 60% did not. And so the good news is that lots of them did not, and that showed to us that they were not essential uses, that PFAS was not an essential use in that product category. So we actually had a term contract come to term, and we were able to put out for bid a new contract and had a number of bidders that in that contract specified that there would be no PFAS in any of the food serviceware that we purchased. And we had a successful bidder. We've been working with that contractor for the last couple of years and ensuring that what we buy does not have fluorinated chemicals. In that process, we found that some of the products that we were looking at were certified as compostable that did have fluorinated chemicals. So we reached out to the certifying body, Biodegradable Products Institute, Rhodes is right here, he's from there, and we contacted Rhodes and said, hey, did you know there's this issue? And at the time they weren't aware of it. And so we, in the spirit of what Jared said earlier today, we worked really collaboratively to address the issue, and they updated their certification standard, which meant then we could look at our whole entire city, since BPI continues to maintain a product registry of products that would not have fluorinated chemicals. And
their new standard went into effect in 2020, and just 2 weeks ago. And so our ordinance specified that no food service ware in San Francisco would contain fluorinated chemicals, and we operationalized that by pointing to the BPI certification. So if you are a taqueria and you're buying food service ware, if you look for the BPI logo, then you will be in compliance. So that went into effect 2 weeks ago for us as well. And so we're really in a transition period working with a lot of different food service operators, from big chains to small mom and pops, to educate them and then help move them towards the right products.
Next to Jen Jackson, we've got Rose Yepsen. Could you wave, please? Great. He's the Executive Director of the Biodegradable Products Institute. He's a national expert in residential food scraps collection and processing with a focus on maximizing organics diversion through the use of compostable packaging. Mr. Yepsen, do you have some opening remarks?
Sure, yes, thank you. BPI, we are primarily a certifier of compostable products. We also advocate and educate around their use in organic waste collection and processing systems. And I think it's fortuitous that I'm between Jen and Tom. As Jen mentioned, we started talking about this at BPI around 2016, which was in my first year as the executive director of BPI. And we had some previous relationships I had with San Francisco Department of Environment. And as we started discussing that and what BPI's role could be, it led me to a workshop at the Green Science Policy Institute that really helped inform what our position could be around fluorinated chemicals. And so throughout 2016 with initial discussions and then the 2017 workshop, by the end of 2017, we had come to a decision about what our rules should be. So our rules were passed in 2017 to forbid the entire class of fluorinated chemicals, which we do through an initial screen of 100 parts per million total fluorine, and then also looking at intentional use, so looking at the safety data sheets for every ingredient used. I think it was interesting this morning to connect it back to this morning looking at hazard traits versus toxicological hazard traits. And we were really looking at the hazard traits and trying to figure out what our role was. We're not the FDA, and looking at persistence, mobility, and bioaccumulation specifically for compost quality. So that's why we decided to enact that policy.
Thank you. And our last panelist is Dr. Tom Bruton, who's a senior scientist at the Green Science Policy Institute. He leads research on PFASs and works to bridge science, policy, and business. His previous research at UC Berkeley focused on the cleanup of chemical contaminants, including PFASs in soil and groundwater. Dr. Bruton, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Sure, thank you. So if you don't know, the Green Science Policy Institute is a scientific NGO based in Berkeley, and we work with a variety of stakeholders to reduce the use of harmful chemicals in consumer products, like food packaging. As you heard before, my current gig at Green Science Policy, where I've been for about 3 years, I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley researching ways of cleaning up PFAS once they become groundwater contaminants, specifically in the context of firefighting foam that contain PFAS. So I've been thinking about this group of chemicals for what feels like a long time now. Our perspective at Green Science Policy is that the entire class of PFAS, all of these chemicals, are a concern. And the main reason for that is the high persistence that we've heard about. That's a characteristic across the class. Some PFAS are more persistent than others. Some break down into other PFAS that are then highly persistent. But that is a characteristic that's shared across the class. And because of that, that leads to the potential for widespread exposure. We see that these chemicals can be transported long distances through the oceans, through the atmosphere, and end up in food chains far from where they were produced or used. Also, some or a number of the PFAS that have been the most studied, and that's a growing handful now, are associated with adverse health effects. So for all of these reasons, we think that this entire class needs to be approached with precaution and should really only be used in applications where they're necessary. And I'd submit that food packaging or food service packaging is probably one of those applications where they're not truly necessary. And the reason that I can say that is because we were involved in a study a number of years ago, actually it was headed up by Simona, in which we and our colleagues collected about 400 samples of fast food packaging from around the country, from different types of establishments, different types of packaging, wrappers, boxes, et cetera. And we screened all of those for total fluorine as a proxy for PFAS. Not exactly the same thing, but a good proxy. And what we found is that only a third of those samples contained total fluorine at levels that looked like PFAS. What that tells me is that 2/3 of those samples didn't contain PFAS. And so there are alternative materials out there already. And so that's how we approach this.
Dr. Bruton. Now we're going to jump back to the middle and introduce our moderators. First, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Simona Balan. If you could wave, please. She's a senior environmental scientist in the Safer Consumer Products Program, where she leads the teams working on PFASs. Prior to joining DTSC, she was senior scientist at the Green Science Policy Institute, managing international projects on the use of flame retardants and PFASs in consumer products. And then next to Dr. Balan, we have Jennifer Branyan. If you could wave. She's an environmental scientist, also in the Safer Consumer Products Program. Prior to joining DTSC, she spent the past 7 years as a chemist and project lead in a large-scale manufacturing company. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to our moderators to lead the panel discussion.
Hey, thank you so much, Asha. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here today on the panel and in our in-person and online audience. I think this is a very fascinating topic, and I look forward to the next hour and a half of our panel discussion. So the purpose of this workshop is really to help us understand what we here at the Safer Consumer Products should do, what would help for us to do under our regulatory framework. So Andre started the day off by explaining the 4 steps of our process. For food packaging, we are very much at the beginning. We're trying to understand if it makes sense for us to propose a priority product that contains food packaging containing PFASs, and if so, what food packaging products. So I'm hoping that our discussion today can help us kind of shed some light on this universe of food packaging with PFASs and where it makes sense for any kind of regulatory involvement as part of our program. So I welcome everybody in the audience, in person and online, to contribute to the panel discussion throughout. But I'd like to get us started with something where actually Carla left off in her talk, and then Tom picked that up. The question of essential uses, right? With food packaging, Tom mentioned that paper that we did a while ago. There we looked specifically at fast food packaging, but there are a lot of different types of food packaging that contain PFASs currently. And so if I remember correctly on Carla's slide, food packaging was listed as either 1, 2, or 3, depending on the application, right? So for some of them, potentially the use is essential. For some of them, the application is essential and useful for society, but there are alternatives. And in some applications, perhaps it's easily substitutable because either it's not essential or there are very ready available alternatives. So I'd like to see if we can unpack that a little bit and see within the universe of food packaging which types of products would fall under these 3 different categories. What's really essential and what's easily substitutable.
I'll start. I'll just throw something out there. I think that Carla mentioned food contact materials being in those categories 1, 2, or 3, and I think some of the food contact materials that are not packaging maybe are the ones that are difficult to move. Am I too far away? Yeah. Okay, thanks. I was just saying that there's more, that food contact materials are a broader universe than food packaging, and they include things used in food processing, for instance, that I have a feeling might be harder to move away from. And part of that is that I just know less about what those materials are and what those applications are, and it's not a lot of publicly available information out there about them.
Yeah, and maybe I'll pick up from there. So that's exactly right. So when we put the paper together, we're talking about food contact materials in general. And I also, before I start that, let me put in the most important caveat, and that is when we have something that's category 3, which we call an essential use, we want to make sure we say that this is essential not because it's going to stay there forever, but because there is no current substitute for it. And we would like everybody to focus on quickly finding substitutes for those things if it is deemed that the presence of PFAS in those uses poses a risk. And so the ones that are, as far as I remember from the paper, the ones that are currently classified as 3 are the more esoteric use that I mentioned as sort of like the greasers within the moving parts of the big machinery that's used for processing food. Whereas the things that we're talking most about, which is direct contact food packaging materials, were definitely category 1, because one of the bases for us making these classifications in the paper was a lot of the work that's being done in Denmark right now, where they've basically removed PFAS from paper products in contact with food, and so we know it's possible, has already been done.
Can I jump in? For us, we mostly are buying sort of your typical takeout foodware, so we're not looking at the larger universe. But in the presentation, I think it may have been yours, Carla, where you talked about this broader universe, and I was thinking to myself, the lubricants, the mold release agents, these kinds of things are potentially in the food packaging, whether or not it was intentional. And so to me, I feel like that the definition of food contact or food packaging materials that DTSC is looking at should be broader. I noticed that you did say that it would include mold release agents, but there are these lubricants on processing equipment, all kinds of other PFASs that are, or products that are used that have PFAS in them that I think need to be considered.
To clarify, would those qualify as food packaging?
Since they are ending up in the product. So for example, we did some testing of products and we were surprised by some of the results because the folks that were manufacturing them said, we don't have any chemistry that has fluorinated chemicals in the product itself intentionally added. And then we found that it was actually the mold release agents and the lubricants used in the equipment to manufacture those products that were causing these high hits of fluorinated chemicals in the product itself. So that product is going to go into compost and potentially contaminate that compost. So we need to look at the whole way the product is produced, not just the product itself and the intentional ingredients in the product.
Yeah, so I would concur with that, and that's one of the reasons we have the sort of two approaches for our restriction. So we're not just looking at intentional use in the ingredients that are used, because that wouldn't cover things like mold release agents, and we're not just looking at the total fluorine because that could miss things as well. It's just sort of a general screening test. It's an indicator. It's not definitive. So we agree with that, and that you really kind of need multiple approaches, and that's also why while we know that it was intentionally used in only really one category of product that we certified, we decided to have the rules across all products that we certify because we didn't want to make any assumptions. So I would just agree with that.
If I can follow up also, a couple of things. One is to go back to a question that I think that was asked of Maricel about whether high-value polymers are going to be cleaner. And I don't know for sure what exactly the industry knows about this, but my guess is that from the evidence we've seen, these are very messy chemicals to produce. We saw a bunch of redacted impurities here. We know from what's happened in Cape Fear that some of the most problematic chemicals are things that the industry did not know they were producing. They're unintentional byproducts. And so actually I want to come back to something Brian mentioned earlier about how there are about 36 chemicals that are approved for use in food contact materials. And whether it should be right that we focus on those, I think we need to focus on those materials and the unintended products that happen when you produce those materials. And so, in thinking about testing for what comes from these materials, I think something we haven't mentioned yet, we talked a little bit about total fluorine, but in general, the use of non-target analysis and what people are thinking about this. It's kind of expensive and complicated, but it seems like an important thing to try and evaluate what's actually ending up in the materials that are used in food contact.
I just have a couple little perspectives to add. I agree with a lot of what the panelists are saying here, and I think the question of necessity gets really complicated pretty quick because it depends on your perspective and necessary to whom. And thinking about even like with alternatives, for example, right now there's a lot of conversation at Cal Recycle about the clamshell, right? The to-go container where you get your sandwich. And there's many different ways you can transport that sandwich, and the molded fiber has a lot of great values for it if it could be compostable in a really safe way without the PFASs. And I think that's really, a tricky area to navigate, knowing that there's many sources to PFASs in the product manufacturing supply chain. So I think that we have to think about these questions kind of in a multi-directional sense. Necessity, thinking about Cal Recycle, I've gone to 2 site visits so far, and there is so much plastic out there. There's so much waste out there, and and I know that Safer Consumer Products has a particular lens by which they think about alternatives, but I think also encouraging conversations to get away from the disposable society so that you don't have so much, and pushing or encouraging more for the reusables and not just by de facto everything is a to-go container. I think that's one important element. And then, it's a bit of a low-hanging fruit. There's so much traction nationally to get PFASs out of food service packaging, and there's several organizations setting proposed levels for what intentionally added looks like. And it seems like if that's the direction that things are going, then kind of a collaborative approach in that sense could be one way that makes sense. There's a mention of kind of having a consistent supply chain and kind of evening out the market. So I think that could be a consideration.
Basically, it sounds like we need to consider not only the intentionally added PFASs to food packaging, but also the manufacturing impurities from the production process, from the mold release agents, lubricants, and any other sources that may end up in the final product. And I wanted to follow up also on Carlos' last comments regarding the number of PFASs that are found in these products. I believe, Maricel mentioned there were 19 different food contact notifications that were approved for use by FDA for any kind of food contact, whether it's in packaging or in these industrial processes. And as we've heard, those 19 substances that are approved contain a lot of impurities, or they have degradation products. So the actual number of PFASs that we expect to find in the food packaging will definitely be larger than that, right? So I have a couple questions about that I'm trying to understand. So one, out of these 19 FCNs that were approved, these 19 substances that are approved, do we know if all of them are being used? My understanding is that when something is submitted to FDA, is usually not withdrawn, even if the substance is not used. I think Chemours is now doing something kind of unique where they are withdrawing their food contact notifications, but I wonder if anybody is aware if all of those remaining, 16 or 17, if all of those are currently being used in food packaging or food processing equipment. If anybody in the audience knows, please, or Baku, if we get any comments from online, please let us know. All right, so that is something that yeah.
I don't know the answer to your question, but I have a question about your question, and that's, do we know how much of that world of chemicals used in the equipment in food processing is captured by those FDA FCNs? Have a lubricant on a machine, is that approved?
When you go in there, they're each specified for an intended use. So every time that you have its own complex, it's for its own specific use. So even if you go in there and you look at one that's specifically for coated paper or paperboard or something like that, you might find that same distinction of the chemical, but it'll say lubricant for machinery, or it'll say something else. So the ones that we've pulled here, like the 30 that are approved of the FCNs, or the 19 distinct formulations, are specifically for food packaging.
If anybody knows an answer to Tom's question, yeah, please.
I'm Clay Mayhood. We do review the lubricants at a certain point in the packaging preparation. So we are at the end point where we're making paper that's going to be printed and made blanks and made into packaging. Our lubricants and oils are FDA approved. Now, I made a note to see if we've got PFAS in them or not, but right now they are FDA approved.
So I think in general, everything that's in contact with food would have to be approved by FDA through the FCN process, unless it is generally recognized as safe. And that's also something I'd like to come back to, because I've been really struggling to figure out if there are any PFASs approved as GRAS, or basically recognized as safe through the GRAS designation. And they're non-listed in the inventory of GRAS substances on the FDA website, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any. Because if I understand correctly from what Maricel said earlier, manufacturers can make the GRAS designation and they don't actually have to inform FDA. At a workshop that Washington State held last year, I asked this question, and a representative from Daikin said that there are no PFASs that are GRAS, that are generally recognized as safe. And so what I'm wondering is, I understand that there are no GRAS PFASs from Daikin, but since a lot of this is confidential business information, Daikin probably doesn't know if any of their competitors have any PFAS that are approved as GRAS. So I'm just curious if anybody has any more information or concrete information as to whether there are any PFASs that are being used and have this GRAS designation from other manufacturers as well. Black box. We're trying to crack it. Yeah, we have a comment there in the audience.
Yes, I'm Mike. I'm with Cormat, and we make packaging. And it's tough because the machine uses lubricants, and even determining what's food contact okay or incidental food contact okay usually just means going to a website. And so it would almost be nice if there was a list of safe lubricants published by California or something, just so we'd have a second place to look. Because right now I just have to go to the website that sells lubricants and then search for food safe, and then that's my validation. So if they say it is, but there's not an extra level past that. So.
Hi, I just would reiterate that the manufacturing facility that we have and that we're building, all of that has to be audited for food safety, and all of the equipment and so on. We make sure everything has FDA approval, and then we go to another level in terms of hygiene and food safety. That's not to say that, as we've discussed, some of those things that are currently FDA approved may contain some PFAS, such as tubing and some other things. So and as far as the other question about GRAS, I'm not aware that there are any PFAS GRAS approvals. So,
I'm stating your name for the record.
Renee Robin.
Thank
you. Scott Coffin, Division of Drinking Water. Just a super quick Google search, literally 2 minutes ago. I found one PFAS in the GRAS list. 1112 tetrafluoroethane. It's probably really volatile, and it's a 2-carbon hydrofluorocarbon.
And what is it used for?
It is approved in food packaging as for flavor and extraction solvent for food flavors.
I just had another thought. So there are standards set forth by the government, and they're actually really quite low for safety, but the fast food chains quite often care more. And so there's like GFSI and SQF, and those are both manufacturing standards that we have to hit. And so, and manufacturers tend to get really pissed off when it's the government that's coming in there, but if it's their customers saying, we want you to hit this. And so, right now there's a certain fast food chain using molded fiber that has a lot of egg on their face, and other ones don't want that. And so if other fast food chains were to adopt this issue, then, like I know it'd be much easier to get my manufacturing partners to adopt it rather than just trying to push it forth in legislation. So. Sorry, this is Mike Wagner.
Hi, this is Kathy Rudisil from SRC. We're working with the Washington State Department of Ecology on the PFAS and food packaging alternatives assessment. And we have been engaging with some stakeholders about the issue of what PFAS are actually being used as far as what's been approved by FDA and what is actually being used. I don't have a concrete conclusion on this because we're relying very much on what Floral Council has been telling us. But they did indicate that there's a subset of what is actually on the FCN list that's actually commercially relevant with regards to the side chain fluoropolymers. How that is relevant to the polyfluoroethers, not sure. And again, this is just going off of what they're telling us. There's really no additional information to support that as far as capacities or use levels, that sort of thing.
In that same vein, I can say that it's written in the scientific literature that the two main types of PFAS used right now to impart grease and oil repellency to paper products are the C6 side chain fluoropolymers and perfluoropolyethers. And I've heard that from folks in industry as well. But again, no specifics.
Some of the compounds in the EDF FOIA package, though, had PFOA listed as an impurity, so that's a C8. I don't know if anybody knows whether those particular compounds are still being used, the ones that have PFOA impurities.
Well, I still have the mic, so I'll just mention that I asked the same question, and when we had interacted with Floral Council, they were emphatic in saying that the C8 and the C10s are no longer in use. Furthermore, the DIPAPs that had been initially approved earlier on, some years ago, are not in use anymore within the United States. Emphasis added.
All right, thank you.
I just thought I'd add, I'm going to channel Jennifer Field. So I attended a conference where she talked about the manufacture of fluorocarbons, and if she likened it to hydrocarbon manufacturing, where you're looking for, say, a C6, that's what you're aiming for, but you get all this other stuff. And so, and probably Carly could speak to that from a chemical engineer's perspective, but you would get a C10 residual or impurity, and maybe C4s and C3s. So it is very common and very likely that you would have a C10 impurity, PFOA.
Turn on my mic. Can I ask a question? About sort of the food packaging landscape in terms of regulation, we're talking about what should be allowed by the FDA, for example, here. A lot of Americans get a ton of their food from internationally traded foods. What is the landscape in terms of regulating food contact materials coming from outside the U.S.?
Want to take that question? That was going to be my follow-up question. So, thank you.
Maybe to make it more concrete, we could ask if a manufacturer is manufacturing something like a molded fiber product in China, say, is there follow through in that supply chain to make sure that that factory is not using a long chain PFAS?
Made sustainable fiber solutions. I won't give you the molded fiber, but on a package, bleach board package,
there are a lot of materials, as we talked last night, there are a lot of materials that actually board from the United States will go to China, it will get printed, it will be converted into blanks, it will get shipped back to the fulfillment centers where the food is being packaged and go through that. And yes, they are subject to the rules and regulations of the FDA to do that. Having said that, you can also know that properties or paper coming from China and other Southeast Asia countries are also supposed to adhere to sustainable forestry practices. And you may have heard about several times when companies go in and do an audit, they're finding original growth forest fiber being present, having to go through that. So there's a diligence that's required on the part of the brand owner and the distribution centers to make sure that it's actually done. So I think the bottom line is you have to question how well are you auditing that whole process and making sure that compliance is indeed maintained.
Hi, my name is Andrea Ventura with Clean Water Action, and I'm sorry I came in late, so if this has been covered, just tell me that and I'll catch up. But one of the things I'm concerned with is, as we're trying to do many things, and I know San Francisco is doing this, trying to deal with waste streams as well as toxic chemicals, what concern do manufacturers have with recycled material coming back through? And if you've covered that, just tell me.
No, actually, that was going to be our next topic. So that's
okay. Then never mind. We'll go into that.
That is a great segue. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about where do we have exposure sources along the life cycle of this food packaging. So there's this black box of this lack of knowledge about what PFASs are actually being used right now, but maybe we can tackle a little bit this issue of where we have exposures throughout the life cycle. And Brian, earlier you mentioned the importance of understanding the supply chain, and I think that's something that we definitely struggle with, like understanding where the PFASs are being introduced, and where there may be exposures during manufacturing, but also at the end of life during recycling, composting, landfilling, or perhaps incineration. What are the exposures there? So I don't know who wants to start this discussion, but please tell me.
I could chime in really quickly. So from San Francisco's perspective, we are concerned perhaps more than just the use phase. We're more concerned about the beginning of production or the production phase and then the end of life. If we are to agree that FDA's exposure assessments are accurate, then we would say, okay, that piece, is not a lot of exposure perhaps, but for people who are manufacturing these products, they are going to have far more exposure than my 15 seconds of a burrito on a plate. And then at the end of the use phase, when it's going to a compost facility, if those materials are not breaking down, so PFASs are not breaking down, I've said this before, it's kind of like a bathtub with no drain. We're just continuing to fill up this bathtub and cannot break down PFAS chemicals at that end of life. So for us, we are trying to change the demand that the city of San Francisco has so that we can really address those two other use phases, but also, of course, to protect our citizens and the compost that we generate.
I'll say, I think, if you're looking at like recycled paper, it would be very difficult when a bale comes into a recycled paper facility, if somebody threw an antique magazine or something that may have long chain PFAS in it from 30 years ago, and that shows up as a part of that bale, you wouldn't be able to catch something like that. And I don't know if that would actually, impact the end product at the end of the day. Just, one thing. The other part of this is that food service packaging is less than 2% of your waste stream. So in those bales that are going into recycled paperboard, like if it's a paper cup or something like that, it's a very small percentage, and so it's not going to show up in large scale when you're looking at the bales. Mostly what you're seeing is cardboard boxes or newspaper or however you layer whatever that end product that's going to come out of the recycled paperboard mill is. It's whatever that mix is that's going in, and recycled food packaging items is going to be a very small percentage of that.
Well, approximately what percentage of food packaging is recycled?
I don't have any of those numbers with me here. I couldn't give anything like that. But I mean, just if you're looking at the entire waste stream, and then you work your way down to that number that ends up at that specific recycled paper mill, the bale is just going to be. It would be very difficult to ascertain like what, is it cups or whatever is coming in that specific bale. So
I think, waste can kind of go in maybe 3 different directions, landfill, compost, and recycling. I think there is potential for PFASs to get in through any of those mechanisms. So I think just kind of going back on the recycling piece, it's my understanding these PFASs don't degrade, right? So if you're going through the recycling process, the paper products go through like a kind of like a slurry, and the intent is to get the fibers and then use that for a new product. Maybe PFASs go along with the new product. Maybe they're in that, residual water that's used for the recycling process, and then what happens to that really depends on the regional water quality requirements for that, which can be kind of a patchwork legislation or regulation. So I think that would be one area to think about is, kind of going back to my earlier question about the cumulative exposure. It's true that the food service packaging is not a huge component of these bales, but when these recycling facilities are processing so much of it, and the PFASs aren't breaking down, they go to the water, and then and then what? And then I think Jen covered the compostability piece pretty well. That we really want compost to be a commodity that can be sold, and if there's going to be enough PFASs in there, that's going to get in the way of that and kind of mess up that whole batch. So,
not speaking on the compost side, but just the recycled paperboard, then you would have to take that, and it would have to become like food service packaging again, which it isn't. So that that process, it wouldn't be an issue.
What does it usually become?
Oh, it's going to, whatever the company's selling. I don't want to speak for the specific companies, but they're not going to manufacture, whatever it is, it's not going to, the percentage would be very low. Sorry.
Can I just, I just want to ask a clarifying question then. So is paper intended for food packaging not supposed to be recycled paper? Is that right?
Is what?
You're not allowed to use recycled fibers in making food packaging?
Companies would need to speak on that individually over what they do with their customers and how that's worked out on that issue. So.
I'll just offer a few comments. My name's Renee Robin. Excuse me. I'm with a company called Zoom, Z-U-M-E. We're a new company. We manufacture molded fiber packaging from waste fiber, primarily wheat straw, bagasse, things like that. There's no question but that every word I use, I'm thinking about what the implications of that are. So if I say it's compostable in an industrial facility or compostable period, I know that I need to look at that entire supply chain to make sure that there aren't externalities, impurities, byproducts, and so on. All that being said, so for the molded fiber industry, it's been interesting for me to hear you talking about the potential exposures of PFAS from other things than the additives that might go into a recipe for a slurry of molded fiber. That's a whole other set of discussion, which I think is really important, but I also think that for the purposes of what DTSC is doing right now, I'm interested to think about how many layers of that onion you're going to take on, because I think this is a potential industry that has a lot of great environmental potential, especially for compost, but it has to be done right, and those companies that are delving into this are trying to figure it out at the same time. So I'm going beyond PFAS for sure, because we're certainly not interested in that being in our product going forward, but that's not where we started. So the alternatives discussion today is going to be really important to us, and we can share what we're doing as well. But I guess my comment was really for CalRecycle, because the compostability aspect of this is so important to us. And when we source that waste fiber that would have otherwise been incinerated in a power plant, and we use it to make a compostable product, it may not have come from an organic farm. So it's going to have something going on in that waste fiber that may have environmental residual concern. So that's something that I would invite people who want to talk about that, that we can pursue it. But I kind of want to focus on the packaging itself. Yeah. All I have to say.
Clay Maywood, Sustainable Fiber Solutions. You can use recycled sometimes. It has to go through a long process to get FDA approval, and it makes it very expensive. It's more often used as indirect, so you can get recycled in an indirect food contact where it's not directly touching the food. In that case, it's approved. Some of the food service packaging materials will go into a multi-layer liner board. It'll go on the inside layers and get absorbed there, and then typically used for corrugated packaging.
Marisol couldn't be here for the panel discussion, but she also she wanted to bring up during this discussion the issue of paper mills and how paper mills are a source of PFAS contamination. She recently co-authored a blog about that, so I wanted to see if anybody here on the panel or in the room wants to comment about paper mills and the associated exposures from that and what could be done to reduce them.
Can you clarify what are they saying, like from emissions, or like how's the
Yeah.
paper mill does?
So I believe they found emissions from PFAS emissions from paper mills in adjacent waters from the manufacturing process. Unfortunately, she's not here, so I'm sorry, I don't know a lot about that, but that seems to be one concern, at least along the life cycle of the packaging.
Zach Limecooler, I'm with Alstrom Munkstra, so we are a paper company that does use PFAS and does it from a legal standpoint with what the FDA requires. So I think we are acutely aware of the downside of all the uses of PFAS, whether it be in the package itself or in those other side streams, whether it be waste generated or other things. And I think it's something that obviously the industry has to be extremely sensitive to and watch. And it would be no different than the actual PFAS chemical manufacturing sites that have to do the same thing. So I think that dovetails into a conversation we have to have, and the industry has, from a paper side of things, which is you have a packaging requirement and you have an effluent requirement, a water requirement. So those are two different things. And one of the things I would always caution, and I have cautioned any discussion I get into, is you are talking about order of magnitude differences, specifically on the types of materials you're looking at and the levels that are present. So when you're talking about water treatment, water quality standpoints, you're in parts per trillion. When we're talking about a BPI regulation on packaging, we're talking about parts per million. So a very, very different, and again, not the same testing or protocols with that testing. So there is a watch out there to make sure that is controlled and that there's controls in place to do that. Again, no different than any industry, especially if you look back at the fluorochemical producers. Sorry. All right, sure. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I would say, as anything, there's always a waste stream concern you have to manage.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. We have a comment from the online audience as well.
Yeah, I have a question from Melody Labella, and she's from the Central Contra Costa Sanitary District. And she's kind of concerned over fate and transport of PFASs in food packaging exposure route. She said she didn't see anything about wastewater. Does DTSC staff or any of the experts have a sense of how significant the amount of PFAS transfer into human waste would be due to transfer of PFAS in human from food packaging. So wastewater, but through sanitary route.
Interesting.
Could I jump back really quickly to piggyback on something that Zach said while we all chew on that question?
Sure.
And my question would be, I mean, you mentioned that it's no different than any other industry, but it's my understanding that effluent limitations for PFAS are not something that have been in place in almost anywhere until maybe now in some jurisdictions. So I would like to see those be in place to make sure that companies who are perhaps not as proactive as yours are paying attention to this.
Question over here.
Lim
Oh, you want to go first?
Just a second.
Yeah, sorry. And to that point, there's a lot of active legislation right now in the United States pending on water treatment and water quality standards specific to PFAS. It's actually probably a more current issue in the water side of things than it is in the packaging side of things by all means. So I think that is coming, and that's a challenge. I think the biggest challenge that we have as an industry in the United States is we are not seeing the federal government do it. We're seeing states do it, which becomes a really big concern from a competitiveness standpoint when you look at the industry across the United States. And then globally, as that trickles out to the rest of the industry, it's where are those levels set, and is a state going to take a very aggressive route, which will potentially cause more issues in an industry than a national level or an adjacent state, for example. So I think you have evidence of Michigan looking at that. Our state, Wisconsin, is trying to lead the charge and setting extremely low levels, which that's a discussion for a different day than this panel probably is. But both of those things are, I think, going on and actually could change the industry faster than anything on the packaging side, quite honestly.
I would just add to there's very few paper mills in California. So this would be a very small piece of the pie that you'd be looking at in terms of charge. So,
Do you know how many?
I believe there was like 5 when I was back on the paper side, but I'm not sure exactly of what's left here in California.
And maybe just to add a consideration for SCPs, they think about this as, it's a global economy. And we're kind of alluding to things going to different states, and that is true. There's not a lot of paper recycling in California, if much at all, and also exports out of the United States. And so as you think about your considerations, it'd be worth noting that not all of the potential for adverse impacts may necessarily be happening here and could be happening in other countries as well.
Just on the water side, I found out Peter Weiner, Weiner. I found out the other day from a consultant who's doing water treatment, basically to remove perchlorate and TCE, that they were specified to use plumber's tape, and the plumber's tape contains PFAS. And so they had to get an alternative so that the water treatment at the wellhead would be pure water. So it's all over. I mean, plumber's tape is a consumer product that can affect our water supply.
Well, I'd like to add a little clarity to the water issue because that's something I'm delving into. And I don't know how much paper mills, and even if it's 5, that can be very significant to a local community. But I don't know how much they are doing, or wastewater, to Ms. Labella's question. But we're in the process of trying to find that out in California, because California probably has the most detections of PFAS. And Dr. Bruton is right. I mean, there have not been effluent out of industry standards. And the problem is, yes, people are starting to think about that at the state level. We're not there yet in California. But in most cases, the states are looking at specific PFAS. So if a manufacturer, whether it's the chemical industry or whether it's a product manufacturer, and it doesn't just have to be this realm of products, decides they're going to use some new C4, C6 chemical, which is probably going to be harder to get out of water in the end, they may not have to worry about that. So the issue of not having effluent standards is going to continue for a while if we continue this approach of looking at PFAS as individual chemicals, because that's traditionally what has been happening elsewhere in the country on the water issue. What you're doing right is you're looking at the class, and I think that's really important. And I'm sure, Simona, you know this, that the State Water Board is doing a site investigation. They're going to look at water wells around all sorts of potential sites, whether it be, paper mills or military sites, and they are looking at what's going on around wastewater. Of course, the wastewater facilities didn't put it there, but they are looking to find out what those sources are, and I think we're going to get a lot more data. What we're getting in so far is that the problem is not just the traditional PFOA or PFOS that are, historically going to be there, but that we are seeing the newer generations of chemicals coming up. So, there's a lot of discussion in the country around what to do about whether it's surface water or drinking water or groundwater or whatever, but nobody has figured that out yet. So I don't think we can rely on that's going to get fixed. I think we need to be talking to the water agencies and seeing how we're going to deal with this, because in the end, they're going to have to deal with what's already out there. DTSC in this program has the capacity to help stop the further bleeding so that we don't keep filling the tub. And you can't do it on everything, like the gentleman said. These chemicals are used in so many different kinds of products, but this is one step toward that.
I just would clear. I was trying to bring it back to food service packaging too, and I don't believe there are any paper mills here in California that produce paperboard that goes into food service packaging. It would be a tissue mill or something like that that's here. So I was just trying to.
And then, I would say, I think connected to this issue and related to end of life for compostability, the issue of what you do when it's detected and in effluent. So like from at a composting facility, it is a state-by-state approach right now, and states are looking at the contact water at a composting facility, and if it has elevated levels of fluorinated chemicals, they're instructed that they can't land apply it because of groundwater issues, but then it's sent to a wastewater treatment plant. And in most states, there aren't rules around removing that completely before it's discharged. So you're not really solving the problem. You're causing, penalizing a composter who's not a generator of that material, and then, at extra expense sending it to a wastewater treatment plant. And then we have this whole issue that was mentioned with the main farmer, right, with the biosolids compost. And the biosolids, composting industry has been really proactive around this and is in a tight spot, both arguing both sides, saying, look, we don't know what's happening to the composted biosolids and if they're actually leaching into groundwater from there. And then at the same time saying, again, looking at the big picture of beneficial use, again, what do you do with those contaminated biosolids? There are a lot of environmental benefits to using those biosolids beneficially on farm fields. And now what are we going to do with them? Put them back in a landfill where it's the leachate will go back to a wastewater treatment plant, or burn them? And we know that even if you're burning them, the incinerators are not hitting temperatures high enough to actually break those fluorinated chemicals down. So I just would say that, it's difficult not to be reactionary on some of these topics, but there are so many other implications downstream when we start looking at what do you do with the contaminated water. And I think that we need to be really cautious about that and make sure that we don't derail, all of these other side industries that are really beneficial, the composting industries.
Can I just jump in? So what all this says to me is that prevention is so important. So to Melody's question around how much comes through our bodies versus how much may be coming from a factory or facility that is discharging, it all comes back to circularity. So whatever we are creating, in terms of PFAS, we are going to end up with it, whether it's back into biosolids or back into our drinking water. So many facilities that discharge are in a separate jurisdiction. They discharge effluent, and then it goes downstream into a river where a water facility is then going to have to treat it. They're going to have to spend millions and millions of dollars to treat the PFAS out of the water that came downstream from a wastewater treatment plant. So to me, we have to work upstream. And so I'm glad that the Safer Consumer Products Program is looking at this particular product category. And we need to get it out of the products to begin with, and then we're also going to have to figure out how to deal with all of the contamination that we already have too.
So that kind of leads me nicely into my next question. So like Andrea mentioned earlier, for our program to designate something, to propose something as a priority product, we need to demonstrate that there is potential for exposures and potential for significant or widespread adverse impacts. And so from our discussion so far, it seems pretty clear that there are exposures to PFASs from food packaging, whether it's during manufacturing use or at the end of life of the product. But so my question for the panel and the audience, what are the potentials for adverse impacts from the use of PFASs in food packaging? What do you see as the most significant or most widespread adverse impacts, if there are any, associated with the use of PFASs in food packaging?
Can I jump in? So I'm not exactly going to answer the question you asked, of course, but I'm going to talk about why that's maybe not the right question. So one is we don't have a lot of data about the specific PFAS that may be found in food packaging. Also, it's evolving. So most of the toxicological data we have and the epidemiological data we have are for PFAAs and for especially the long-chain PFAAs. And we know that there are significant effects on lipid metabolism, on liver health, kidney health. It has been linked to many adverse effects, developmental effects. We're always going to be arguing about, is this significantly adverse? Because we've moved away from acute toxicology, right? We're not at the point where we eat something and we have to go to the hospital. And so we're talking about chronic, especially for something that's basically totally persistent, ongoing, lifetime, since before you were born, exposure to chemicals. And one of the issues we have is this idea that we have to prove something's going to have a negative impact before we can do something about it, when that substance is basically indefinitely persistent, such that when we discover that there's a problem, oh well, how are we going to now reverse that problem when the stuff is out there and we have a really hard time taking it out of our drinking water and our products? So I think something Tom pointed out at the beginning is that the biggest hazard of these chemicals is their persistence. Humans are really bad at risk assessment, and we are also really bad at anticipating the unintended consequences of stuff. And let me point out an earlier fluorinated substance for which this is sort of really famous, and that is fluorocarbons. Look, we have these totally inert, absolutely safe chemicals that are never going to do anything bad, and suddenly we have a whole ozone layer that nobody foresaw. And so the issue with a persistent substance is that there will be an unintended consequence in the future that we cannot foresee, and if we allow it to be released, then we're stuck with the problem.
Well, we can come back to that if anybody else has comments from the online audience or from the room. But meanwhile, something else to think about. So, Rhodes, you kind of alluded to that when we have this food packaging with PFASs, there are exposures to the environment, whether we compost it or landfill it or whatever we do with it. So, what would you say is the best thing to do with PFAS-containing food packaging? What is the responsible end-of-life fate of these products? The most responsible, according to our current technology and abilities to deal with them.
I think the silence is indicative of it's a big problem, and we shouldn't have them there in the first place. So, I mean, there's a lot of different folks who are working on disposal technologies, but shouldn't we be investing in the greener chemistries and the alternatives rather than these downstream solutions? I'll jump in again. I do think we need an all-the-above strategy, right? So absolutely we need to turn off the tap, but we have the problem now, and there are a lot of communities that are stuck, and it's going to be really expensive. But I think, if I had to say what should we do, I think we need to work on getting our incineration technology to be good enough. Because as long as we get it to be good enough, such that we're not just moving everything to the air where it'll come back down on us, that's the only proven technology. We have to absolutely destroy these substances, because I think just sticking them in a container somewhere is just putting off the problem until later.
I also think that we should be taking steps to monitor PFAS in some of these places that they end up once food service materials are disposed of. We should be looking thoroughly at landfill leachate, and I know California is going down that path, but it's taken a while to get there. We should be looking at compost probably to make sure that we're not, adding compost with unacceptable, whatever that might be, levels of PFAS back to our agricultural lands. So those are not ways to solve the problem, but those are ways to stop it from getting worse in specific areas.
Peter Weiner again. I think from the perspective of CalRecycle, for example, on diversion of organics and so on, that this is a real issue with 1383, I think it is. And I know of one company at least, and Mr. Yepsen, I'd be interested in, or Dr. Yepsen, be interested in your data, but I think one company is testing incineration and believes that they're destroying them, but I don't know the test methods. I don't actually have figures yet. And if that's possible, then at least in terms of an existing problem, that may be not a solution, but at least better than landfilling. So I don't know. The people are testing to look.
Yeah, and that may be true, but I think getting back to sort of the whole intent of a compostable product or package, if we're putting it into a landfill or an incinerator and you can actually hit it, it's, sort of gets away from the whole point. And so I think that's where, if in the interim, and this is my personal belief, is that in the interim, while we're working on upstream reduction, that we also still have to weigh the risks of what's in our environment today. And that I think one of the big concerns that I see is this risk to organics diversion programs that have been, very hard fought to get so successful, whether that's food waste and yard trimmings composting or biosolids composting. And that, again, we don't want to penalize those programs. So I agree we should be testing, but not if that means that we're going to then tell composters you can't sell that compost. Unless there's some crazy risk. So the main farmer, that compost maybe should have not been sent to that farm. But I think if there are relatively low levels, I think we need to figure out maybe alternative uses for that compost. Maybe it goes to non-food uses. But I think being careful to not jeopardize those composting programs while we weigh the risks and balances, and penalizing the right parts of the value chain, not the people who are receiving it, because then, so I think about high temperature incinerators. Sure, but isn't that kind of, it just seems like the wrong place to be focusing for in my opinion.
I agree with you that it's not good to be penalizing those systems, those waste diversion systems that are there. But I do think that getting the data to have those kinds of conversations where you figure it out among stakeholders is important, and that testing is how you get that data.
Yeah, I agree.
May I chime in? Tom, you talked about measuring total fluorine as a surrogate for PFAS, especially if you can't quantify and speciate what PFAS is there. And you had talked about the importance of maybe doing some studies on what's in wastewater, what's in compost, and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that technique and how are there concentrations of total fluorine that are indicative of PFAS versus inorganic fluorine or something like that?
I think the answer to that last question of what is a concentration threshold that indicates intentional addition of fluorine is dependent on both the application that you're talking about, whether it's packaging, say, or carpet, and also on the technique that you're using. So the technique that I was referring to has been dubbed PIGGY, particle-induced gamma-ray emission spectroscopy. And Graham Peasley at Notre Dame, who's pioneered using that for this type of analysis, has taken paper that he got from paper manufacturers that he knows contains intentionally added PFAS to make it oil resistant, measured those and seen what kind of reading he gets back. And he's also taken paper that he knows is not intentionally treated. And so he's come up empirically with a threshold, and that's what we were using in those types of studies. Not something necessarily you could take and start applying in other places. There's a lot of groundwork that has to go into it.
For the paper, he had done that correlation or those tests, but you might not be able to use it on compost, say, or something.
That's right, yeah.
And we worked with Graham on that to sort of do a back of the napkin comparison to the types of results that we get from the labs for total fluorine, because they don't totally match. And the 100 parts per million that we use is relatively comparative to the threshold he had come up with for intentional use. But I think that, again, it's a good quick screening method, but it's not enough on its own. And so we see, for instance, in compostable products, there can be sources of inorganic fluorine in a product from materials that are mined that are naturally occurring, or it could be from contaminated water source, things like that. And so one of the ways that we do that with that dual approach of both looking at intentional use in a formula versus it coming from an inorganic source or a contaminated water source is that you can start to break that apart. So if you just look at something like an inorganic fluorine coming from talc or calcium carbonate, you can test the finished product and then you can test that talc separately and do simple math. And if they add up, then you know where it came from, similar to the water. So if talc wasn't the source and it's still higher, then you could say, okay, well, we need to test the water source. And I think that that's been one helpful way, but for sure we need a lot of help, I think, continuing to develop the test methods for total fluorine, because the PIGGY method is giving different types of results than a lot of the labs that we use with standardized test methods. And part of that is because this is still so emerging, and a lot of the standardized test methods for total fluorine were not set up for packaging. They were set up for things like fuel. And so there's a lot of work being done on that right now. There's an ASTM, part of the ASTM D2096, which is the subgroup working on compostable standards, where our ASTM D6400 and D6868 live. There's a subgroup in there that is looking at total fluorine testing and things like how, standardizing the way that samples are prepared before tests. We have at BPI some general rules around sample preparation before you do a total fluorine test. We don't, in general, do not allow extraction, but do allow digestion to prepare the sample before the samples are analyzed. But within that, there's sort of a whole other range of what is actually done. And so ASTM is looking at that in minimum sample sizing and things like that.
Hi, this is Carl. I want to change perspective a little bit. As Andre laid out in our framework, it's our responsibility at DTSC to pick a specific product or products contain specific chemical or chemicals from our candidate chemical list. And our approach in this sector is that we're looking at the whole class of PFAS. And I think we all, per our research and discussion, we're pretty comfortable looking at the class and think that we can document that there's potential for adverse impact from this class of chemicals. But what I want to ask the panel about is really more of a somewhat strategic, practical question, which is one of our challenges at DTSC is looking at in this space and in others is that there are such a wide variety of products, and yet we have to actually be specific about what type of product we're looking at within that class of food packaging, for example. So my practical question is, and maybe Jen and maybe Daphne could speak to this based on their experiences, we're aware that if you look at one type of packaging, it might push people to a different type of packaging. And you may be aware that the department is also looking at orthophthalates and BPA and polystyrene for the same types of concerns. So I'm wondering if there's sort of a practical filter from your experience which would suggest where we might look, and are there certain types of packaging that we should look at that would be less likely to push to a different type of packaging that might raise additional or similar concerns, not PFAS, but maybe it's BPA or something else. So it's a little different perspective, and I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that.
In San Francisco, most of our work has been related to takeout food serviceware. We had done some studies in the early 2000s to look at what was going into our landfill-bound bins. And we had a fairly robust recycling program. We had a yard waste program. But what we saw in the landfill-bound bin was a lot of takeout foodware. We're a very urban city, so lots of restaurants, et cetera. So that was a waste stream to us that felt like we could potentially address to try to minimize what's going to landfill and divert for climate change purposes. So at that time, it was a lot of polystyrene foam products, and so we had passed an ordinance that then eventually led to a lot of these molded fiber products coming into the market. So we banned polystyrene, and the regrettable substitute in some ways was these molded fiber products with PFAS chemicals. Heartening news, though, because of our next ordinance, what we learned, what we didn't know, was that a lot of the molded fiber sector is trying to move out of using fluorinated chemicals. But I think that that particular product type is here to stay. So, you know, what we're already seeing is there's a shift in the marketplace for the products that already exist. The areas that I'm concerned about are those that don't really fit into the takeout food service ware. Like the popcorn bags, the maybe the carton that contains your cereal. Those products are still potentially going into compost or recycling and could contaminate those waste streams. So from what we're doing, at least in San Francisco, we feel like we are starting to handle the takeout food service ware space, but these other food packaging materials outside of that, we haven't addressed.
I think there's a couple ways we can probably think about it. One thing that comes to my mind is kind of not thinking about them necessarily as products, but as materials, and trying to go towards the common buckets that those fall into, because things get sliced and diced in different ways, and you can transport a sandwich in many different ways, for example. So, you know, that might be one way to think about it, and then also knowing that in the end, where are those products most likely to end up? So for example, there's so much effort on the, you know, kind of the clamshell type of thing to make it either into, you know, recycling for plastics or for compostability. But then what happens with all the other stuff, right? The things that could be replaced with a plastic film, right? And those are not very recyclable, if at all. So that would be another trade-off to think about. The other element that kind of comes to my mind is again the clamshell. There's so many, they're just so widespread, and everybody uses them. They're so prevalent, and from my understanding, PFASs are consistently found in those products. So that type of product is perfect from a CalRecycle perspective. For it should go into the compost bin when it's done. Right, that's what we want to happen, but not if they're filled with PFAS. So that seems to be kind of like maybe like a lower hanging fruit from our perspective, because it's so tied in directly to getting those products to compost.
I would just reiterate that and say I think when we looked at, you know, essentiality from BPI's perspective, we were looking at generally the range of compostable food service or food contact items, and saying that, you know, when we first were getting into this in 2016, 2017, we weren't looking at, is there a direct replacement for PFAS, because PFAS is not essential to compostability. And so we were looking at, really, are there other methods of having a compostable takeout container, and, you know, as that interim, right? So not just saying it has to be a direct replacement for that chemical. And so it could be a replacement for that chemical, which there's a lot of movement on that, and it's great. But it could also be alternative things, like a coating on that molded fiber item, a foamed biopolymer. It could be a clear, you know, PLA takeout container. There are a lot of other ways of doing that, even within just the compostability world, not even considering switching to a recyclable container like aluminum or something like that. So I would agree with that, and I think that gets into that essentiality thing, gets really tricky. Essential in what regard?
I want to just add something anecdotal to Carl's question and to Jen's comments, because I can't say this scientifically. But I happen to live in San Jose, which is not as good at managing waste and figuring out what to do about these things as San Francisco is. So I live in a residential neighborhood, very nice neighborhood, but I live across the street from the main post office. Consequently, it's a trash collection area because the federal government doesn't go and pick it up, okay? So what I see every morning when I'm walking my dog is primarily food packaging on the ground that people they've got their kids in the van and they just leave it on the sidewalk. But in the Bay Area, because of the cost of living, even the nicest neighborhoods have, of course, homeless communities, people living in their vans who are also bringing, it's not just takeout food packaging, they will also have supermarket packaging. And so one of the things that a national campaign called the Mind Store campaign has done is go into supermarkets and try to look at what's in certain kinds of packaging. They've actually done some testing. I think they'll be sharing some of that information with you, Carl and Simona, because, you know, you're right, Jen, that, you know, we know that in pastry bags or pizza boxes or the clamshells, that has been a traditional problem. But what about the butter boxes? Popcorn, yes, but people in vans are probably not popping popcorn, but that's an obvious one. And what's in the other things that people are buying and then without trash receptacles on the street are just leaving outside their vehicles because that's where they're living. But I have to tell you that it's terrible. I mean, the amount of waste that collects from this stuff, and what happens is, because in our case, it's federal property and they, you know, they're not like my apartment that goes out and cleans up the sidewalk. It sits there for months. And whatever's in that packaging, I can see the dyes running into the soil. So whatever in that packaging is leaching into soil.
Yeah, I had a kind of a follow-up. I think I heard either Rose or Jen talk about, well, there was some discussion of clamshells and essentiality. Is it essential to use PFAS for the mold release agents for molded fiber clamshells, or are there alternatives already available for that? Do you know?
I don't believe it's
I'm
essential.
just going to say, oh, sorry, steam works really well.
Yeah, and I mean, and to be clear, it's not just molded fiber items that have mold release agents. There are other items that pop out of a mold, but no, it's my understanding that there are alternatives that are not fluorinated, even if fluorinated chemicals work very well for that.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Is there any comment or question from online? No, okay. All right, we'll read that first.
Hi, Kathy Rudisil again. I had a question for the panel. I noticed that some of the panelists are participating and actively engaged in the transition to alternatives. And I was curious as to what their challenges have been with that transition and any kind of methods or approaches they've used to manage those challenges.
So we're going to discuss that in a lot more detail in the afternoon. Do you mind if we leave that for the afternoon? Okay, thank you. Unless somebody wants to make a quick comment. Okay, we'll get back to that.
Very quickly, from the perspective of working directly with food service operators, the first big challenge has been to have a list of products that don't have fluorinated chemicals. So here comes BPI's list, product registration, which is very useful. But then also making sure that people know that for us in San Francisco, that it's a requirement now to use products that are Biodegradable Product Institute certified. So just that outreach and education of thousands and thousands of different food service operators, whether it's grocery stores, delis, taquerias, mobile food trucks. It's a huge education push.
And I do have an online question from Juan Villaromero, and he comments that the European Commission Food Safety Authority suggests daily food intakes for both PFOS and PFOA. How can we take advantage of this information to avoid duplicative efforts during regulation?
Would anybody like to comment on that?
Just to say that I thought about this when Marisol was presenting, and she showed that slide where one of the companies had reported that PFOA was an impurity at some certain level that was actually reported in that FDA certification, and I would be really curious to see how that compares with those European TDIs, because they're quite low.
And this is Andre Algazi following up. Earlier I had said, I talked about, you know, the way our standard is a narrative standard and not a risk-based standard. So from our perspective, we're asking the question, whatever that level is, given that there is potential for exposure, is it necessary to use any PFAS? So we're sort of sidestepping how to use that because it's not part of our framework per se.
Okay. So that was a lot of information and also still a lot of unknowns, it sounds like. As Andre mentioned earlier and as Carl basically reemphasized, we are trying to figure out what makes sense for our program to pursue, also in terms of what product, right, out of this universe of food packaging, it would make sense for us to propose to list as a priority product. And so when we make such a determination, we think about the potential for exposures, we think about potential for adverse impacts, which to us mean not just toxicological hazard traits, but also persistence, bioaccumulation, transfer to the fetus and the baby, and as well as adverse waste of life impacts. So any adverse impacts to wastewater treatment plants or to composters would also be highly relevant to us. So I'd like the panel to maybe take a moment and think about what you would recommend that we do. How should we move forward from today? What do you think we should do? Should we pursue a priority product? And if so, what should be the scope of that product definition? So I would hope to hear from everybody if you're willing to share your thoughts, and if you have any other closing thoughts to share. And yeah, feel free to take a moment, and whoever wants to start.
I've already put forward my recommendation for molded fiber. And I don't think I've really laid out all the pieces completely, but the end of life pathways are more and more complicated. We previously historically had exported a lot of our waste. A lot of that is a little bit upside down right now, and markets are beginning to develop more domestically to handle that. At the same time, CalRecycle is working on very significant regulations for organics diversion. It's that 1383 that somebody had mentioned earlier, and that's going to require all the jurisdictions to start moving the organics out from landfills and into other places, which, hopefully a lot of that will be composters. So with that in mind, thinking about the pathways for the different products, like let's say there's, so the options were like molded fiber, coated paper, and was there one other one that?
Well, we listed paper, paperboard, and molded fiber, but I mean, the options could be any subset of that, or maybe there's something else we're missing. So
just thinking about the paperboard, lined paper, ideally I guess that stuff could be composted. I think a lot of times it's more likely put in a recycle bin. Would it actually find a market? Would it actually make it to a recycler? It depends on the market of the day, from my understanding, which may not be completely correct. So I think between the reasons for the amount of PFAS in the molded fiber and the likelihood for those to get to a compost facility once these more infrastructure starts changing from 1383, I think it'll be well lined up.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I think with that in mind, that it's hard to focus on a product category, right? And so if it's really food contact related, and as Jen mentioned, food service products are one, but there are other food contact, packaging materials out there. And so if we're looking at food contact packaging traditionally not being recycled and potentially being composted in the future as the infrastructure develops under 1383, and as if SB 54 passes and pushes all packaging into one stream or another, reduce, reuse, recycle, or compost, I think that it would be better not to focus on just a product, but look at materials that are going into a particular waste stream, even if that's more challenging. So maybe that's multiple products to make up that, and making the categories broad enough to make sure that you're catching the majority of them, even if you maybe miss one.
And just to clarify, I was operating under the assumption that you're looking to narrow things down.
And I was saying I don't agree with
Because of course, if we can go broader and get everything, then of course that would be the best way to go forward. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that we're constrained by our work plan, which the product category we have in the work plan is the one that I showed on a slide. So it's that's kind of the boundaries that we're looking at currently. So I don't know if this is okay, Simone. I maybe reframe the question. If you had to prioritize what we would do first, assuming we can't do everything all at once, what would you prioritize?
Could we still do those three? Because again, I think that would capture the bulk, right? If you could do molded fiber, paperboard, and paper. I mean, paper was one of the categories. I mean, all paper. So like, would that cover the microwave popcorn bag, which is not paperboard? And then I think if you have to prioritize one of those three, you'd look at what the highest concentration is across those three, right? So, using the product sampling and reduction as the first priority, if you could only choose one, you'd want to look at which has the most in it and then work down.
I'm going to put in another plug for going after molded fiber, and I shouldn't use the word going after because I don't want it to be like picking on molded fiber, but I do think that of these three that we've talked about, it's the one that we have the best understanding of, and that makes it more actionable for you at the moment. I do think that we need to do more to understand what other types of paperboard, food service packaging might contain PFAS, but we know that a lot of the molded fiber does, and that it's going to compost, and that exposure pathway is pretty clear. So I think that's something that you could begin to act on.
I'll jump in and just say kind of a couple general things that come to my mind. And I think the first one is just reiterating what we heard at the very beginning of the day, how important continued collaboration is as this process goes forward. And I think that's important for two different aspects of it is that you continue to collaborate at a national level, whether it's with FDA, the national trade associations like the one I work for, and the other ones that are out there, because a patchwork regulatory system in the United States is what's going to drive cost and other considerations. It's difficult for operators when you start seeing regulations in a patchwork framework. And I think definitely a next step is certainly to talk with your food service operators in the state to get a feel for what they're using, what's available to them. They have catalogs that they order out of, whether it's a Chinese restaurant, down the street to a large branded restaurant. They're going to be picking through a catalog or selecting their items. So really try to get a feel for what's available to them, what they need, from a performance standpoint, what do their customers demand, and then certainly you'll get a better feel for what the reality of cost associated with any regulatory change. So I think that's going to be an important next step, is certainly with the operator sides. And I'll just say from our perspective, we look forward to being a part of the process and continuing the dialogue with y'all.
Hi, my name is Joanne Brash. I'm with the California Product Stewardship Council. We strongly support adding foodware, food packaging treated with PFAS as a priority product. We do prefer a definition that incorporates all materials in direct contact with food. But what's most concerning to us is that the public has no way of knowing that these toxic chemicals are in their food packaging and the food that they consume, nor do they have a way to protect themselves. Even if there was a labeling requirement, it merely informing the consumer is not sufficient enough to protect human health. So therefore, we're asking DTSC to take swift, decisive action to ban these known cancer-causing chemicals from all food contact. And I know that's in the regulatory process, therefore, thereafter, this listed as a priority product, but we just want to let our intentions be known in the beginning. Thank you.
We have just a few minutes. Would our last two panelists like to say that?
Just had a thought. I don't know how actionable it is, but I was thinking about where PFASs are used or why they're used, and it's for the function to confer water, oil, or grease repellency. And so I just wonder if the product category could be any food contact materials that are meant to be water, oil, or grease resistant. And then, in combination with PFASs. So it casts a broader net, but it could address the places where it's most likely to be used.
Hi, my name is Sue Chang with the Center for Environmental Health. I know you're talking about alternatives later this afternoon, but I did have a question for roads that I wanted to ask now, since you're up here. I was kind of curious as far as the applications you're getting for products to be certified under the new requirements. What kind of, how many, I don't know if you're able to say that, but how many are you getting, and how long is the process taking? I was wondering if you could just say more about sort of what the outlook is for some of these alternatives.
Sure, I can share some. I can't share a lot. Unfortunately, as soon as somebody signs a confidentiality agreement with us, even the intent to certify is covered under that. So what I can say is there's a lot of interest in this, whether that's alternatives in a molded fiber category, so different wet end additives or coatings, as well as alternatives to molded fiber, like we talked about before. So foamed biopolymers or more types of rigid takeout containers. So there's a lot of interest, and I would say that as of January 1, so around on the holiday break, we delisted thousands of products. And so that is not a good thing for us to do. We're a membership-driven organization. It was very, challenging for a lot of our members. And so I think what we're seeing is members taking that challenge, and turning it into an opportunity, which is good. And so whether that's, the existing members or a lot of new companies coming in as well. So it's a little vague answer, but just there is a lot of interest. And in terms of timelines, there is a lot of interest in compostability in general. So we are completely bombarded with requests, and the labs, testing labs are completely bombarded. So there are waiting lists to do any type of test at our approved labs. We just added a third one in the US recently, which is great. So that'll help. And we welcome other labs to join. The latest one is at a university, so anyone can qualify. You just have to be ISO compliant or audited, and the process to get approved is free. And so there's that delay, and then there's the staffing delay. We just hired 3 new people last week, so we're trying to keep up with requests in general. And then I think there's also just a challenge around, re-engineering products. So not the new products coming in, but re-engineering a category is really tricky, both for the manufacturer, of course, to figure out what will work, but also for certifiers to figure out exactly what changes have been made, especially when you're talking about ingredients that are used in really small amounts. So we've had to add extra layers of scrutiny around things like molded fiber products, with letters from factory locations detailing things like, do they have separate lines in place, which we haven't had to do before. So that's also slowing things down. And then the last thing I would say about that's slowing things down is the safety data sheets are not uniform, right? And so we've been learning a lot about that and updating our requirements around carcinogens, reproductive toxins, et cetera. But for fluorinated chemicals as well, it's not always apparent in a safety data sheet. And we have to sign extra confidentiality agreements with those suppliers who are oftentimes, understandably, very resistant to sign a confidentiality agreement with us. So that adds another layer of really slowing down the process.
So I'd like to give Carla a minute if you have any final remarks.
Some final thoughts. I think I was pretty clear where I stand in terms of persistent chemicals in general. So for me, of course, if you're trying to prioritize, we need information about levels. I think as Rhodes said, you would go after the thing that's there in highest concentrations. And so there, in terms of talking also about collaboration, I often hear from industry saying that they would like to have kind of an even playing field, and this is an issue with states having different levels. And I think as scientists, we feel the same way when we're kind of swimming in this sea of unknowns of which products are used where and what quantity. That would also help really clarify things. I mean, if that information was available, I understand
confidential business information in the sense of formulations maybe giving someone a competitive advantage, but this is critical information for about whether something should be allowed in a product or not. And so I think that definitely needs to be more movement in that area to make these things more transparent, because if everybody's looking for clarity and an even playing field, I think that would really help.
Yeah, so that was very well said. Thank you so much to everybody for participating today on this panel. I can't reiterate enough how important it is that we hear from all these different perspectives, because yeah, it is a patchwork of information and there are a lot of black boxes, and if we are to move forward in a meaningful fashion, we need to take everything into consideration. So I really appreciate your time and your knowledge and wisdom that you shared with us today. And please come back for the afternoon. We're going to have a very interesting discussion on alternatives. So the afternoon, that's a very critical part as well as we think about proposing anything as a priority product. Well, one of the questions is, what are the alternatives? Because we do not want to incentivize any regrettable substitutions. So please go have your lunch and come back for more interesting discussion on alternatives to PFAS. Thank you everyone so much.
We'll be reconvening at 1:30.
All right.
But,